Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst, or perhaps helmet first, into the rather peculiar and wonderfully inventive world of the 1920s. Picture yourself not in your quiet, darkened room, but amidst the clatter, the jazz, the sheer unadulterated noise of the roaring 20s. It's an era of flappers and Ford Model Ts, of burgeoning radio waves, and the birth of talking pictures, a time of immense energy and, as it turns out, a growing sense of overwhelming distraction. Tonight, we're exploring the curious case of one particularly strange attempt to combat this sensory overload. The 1920s Isolator helmet, a device so wonderfully weird, it was reputedly and perhaps quite understandably banned from most libraries. Now imagine trying to get some serious, deep philosophical thinking done, or perhaps just trying to quietly read a rather dense novel in the middle of a crowded 1920s speakeasy. You've got a jazz band blaring away with gusto in one corner, flappers enthusiastically charlestoning up a storm on a makeshift dance floor in another, and quite possibly someone in the next room, enthusiastically and very loudly demonstrating the amazing cleaning power of their brand new engine-powered vacuum cleaner invention. Your chances of achieving profound intellectual enlightenment, or even just making it through Chapter 3 without a major headache, would be, let's just say, about as high as finding a genuinely sober, contemplative thought at a party thrown by the great Gatsby himself. It was, for all its undeniable glamour, an era of glorious, magnificent, and often quite deafening distraction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from tonight and what the time is in your particular corner of this increasingly noisy modern world. Pop it in the comments. It's always great to see where our sleepy stories land. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself Egeria transported, not to ancient Rome, or the misty forests of the Celts this time, but to the vibrant, cacophonous, and rapidly changing world of the 1920s. The Great War, that terrible conflagration that had engulfed Europe, is finally over, and a new, almost frenetic energy is coursing through Western society, particularly in the burgeoning cities of America and Europe. It's the Jazz Age, the era of Art Deco, of unprecedented technological advancement, and of profound social upheaval. Hemlines are rising. New dances are scandalizing the older generation, and the world, it seems, is suddenly moving at a much faster and considerably louder pace. A mainstream historical fact is that the 1920s, often romantically dubbed the Roaring Twenties, was indeed a period of intense social, technological, and cultural transformation. It witnessed rapid urbanization, with more people than ever before living in crowded, bustling cities. The proliferation of new technologies like the automobile, the radio, and the telephone, while bringing undeniable conveniences, also dramatically altered the sensory landscape, contributing to a general sense of dynamism, excitement, and often a rather overwhelming level of background noise. The 1920s weren't so much roaring in a gentle, leonine sort of way as they were enthusiastically and continuously shouting directly into your ear, while simultaneously learning to play the saxophone, often quite badly, and also inventing several new and exciting types of extremely loud factory machinery. Peace and quiet for many urban dwellers were rapidly becoming luxury items, perhaps sold discreetly under the counter at the local illicit speakeasy alongside the bootleg gin. Imagine yourself walking down a city street in, say, New York or London or Paris in the mid-1920s. The air is thick with the fumes and the incessant honking of Ford Model Ts and other newfangled automobiles chugging along newly paved roads. Streetcars clang their bells, elevated trains rattle thunderously overhead, and the sounds of construction, pneumatic drills riveting machines, provide a constant percussive soundtrack to urban life. From open windows drift the tinny strains of jazz music spilling from a new radio set, or perhaps the scratchy melodies of a phonograph record. Inside offices, typewriters clatter, telephones jangle insistently. Even leisure time is becoming louder. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that early silent film screenings in the 1920s, far from being the truly silent experiences their name might suggest, were almost invariably accompanied by live and often quite vigorous musical accompaniment. A pianist and organist thundering away on a mighty Wurlitzer, or even a small orchestra, would provide a continuous score, not just to create mood and emotional cues for the audience, but also quite practically to drown out the distracting mechanical whir and clatter of the film projector itself, and indeed the often quite noisy audience. So even a trip to the silent movies added substantially to the daily auditory assault. This constant barrage of noise, this quickening pace of life, this proliferation of new stimuli naturally began to take its toll on people's ability to concentrate, to engage in quiet contemplation, or to perform focused mental work. Historians and cultural critics continue to debate whether the perceived crisis of attention or the sense of distraction overload, often attributed to the early 20th century and its burgeoning modernity, was a genuinely new psychological phenomenon brought on by these new conditions. Or whether it was perhaps more of a recurring human concern about the pressures of a changing world that simply found new technological and social expressions in periods of particularly rapid societal transformation. But regardless of its historical novelty, the feeling was real. For many in the 1920s, the world was becoming a very distracting place, and finding a quiet corner for focused thought was increasingly difficult. If you think your constantly buzzing smartphone notifications and the endless scroll of your social media feed are a modern invention designed to shatter your concentration into a million tiny pieces, Egeria, just imagine trying to concentrate deeply on, say, writing a complex philosophical treatise, or even just balancing your household accounts back in the 1920s. You've got a Model T enthusiastically backfiring right outside your window. Like it's auditioning for a part in a particularly percussive opera, your next-door neighbor is attempting to master the Charleston with the aid of several enthusiastic, if slightly rhythmically challenged friends, and a very loud gramophone. And quite possibly someone in the apartment downstairs is trying to communicate with the spirit world, or perhaps just their cousin in Chicago via a very new, very loud, an incredibly experimental crystal radio set that seems to be picking up more static and otherworldly wailing than actual coherent messages. It makes your current email inbox look like a veritable Zen garden of tranquil contemplation by comparison. It is precisely within this environment of growing societal clamor, this perceived crisis of attention, that the desire for silence, for focus, for a refuge from the relentless sensory onslaught begins to gain traction. And it is this very desire that will lead an inventive, if somewhat eccentric mind to conceive of a rather peculiar and ultimately rather infamous solution. A personal sensory deprivation device designed to create an oasis of perfect, uninterrupted concentration. We are, of course, talking about the Isolator helmet, a contraption so wonderfully strange, so audaciously impractical that its story, including its alleged and perhaps for our sleepy narrative purposes, slightly exaggerated banning from most libraries, becomes a curious little footnote in the annals of well-intentioned but ultimately misguided inventions. The stage is set. The noise levels are rising, and the desperate need for a little bit of peace and quiet is about to give birth to a truly bizarre piece of headgear. The Roaring Twenties are in full cacophonous swing Egeria. You're surrounded by a veritable symphony of modern noise. The clatter of Model T Fords, the blare of jazz trumpets, the insistent jangle of newfangled telephones, and the general energetic hubbub of rapidly expanding city life. Peace and quiet, as you've quickly gathered, are becoming increasingly rare and precious commodities. In such a world practically vibrating with new sounds and exciting distractions, the ability to truly concentrate, to engage in deep, focused thought, might well feel like a superpower only attainable by particularly stoic librarians or hermits living in very remote, very well soundproofed caves. It is against this backdrop of sensory overload that our protagonist, the inventor of the rather peculiar device that gives our sleepy history its name, steps onto the stage. His name is Hugo Gernsback, and he is a man whose mind was as restless and as inventive as the era itself. Hugo Gernsback was not your average, staid early 20th century gentleman. Born in Luxembourg in 1884, he emigrated to the United States in his youth, bringing with him an insatiable curiosity, an entrepreneurial spirit, and a profound fascination with science, technology, and the seemingly limitless possibilities of the future. A mainstream historical fact is that Hugo Gernsback is widely and rightly regarded as one of the key pioneers of science fiction as a distinct literary genre. In 1926, he founded Amazing Stories, the first magazine dedicated exclusively to publishing what he initially termed scientifiction, a wonderfully clunky, if admirably descriptive portmanteau that eventually gave way to the more familiar science fiction. The prestigious annual Science Fiction Achievement Awards, the Hugos, are named in his honor, a testament to his foundational role in shaping the genre that would later give us everything from space operas to dystopian nightmares. Hugo Gernsback didn't just think outside the box when it came to stories and inventions. He seemed to operate in a delightful, slightly off-kilter parallel dimension where the boxes hadn't even been invented yet and everyone communicated via thought helmets and personally owned miniature zeppelins. Before Amazing Stories, Gernsback had already made a name for himself as a publisher of popular science and technology magazines. Titles like Modern Electrics, which he started in 1908, and which incidentally published the very first science-fiction story by Gernsback himself. Ralph 124C41+, in serialized form starting in 1911, Electrical Experimenter, and later Science and Invention were hugely popular. These magazines were aimed at the amateur inventor, the radio ham, the home experimenter, the technologically curious layman. They were filled with articles explaining the latest scientific breakthroughs, diagrams for building your own gadgets from crystal radio sets to slightly alarming electrical devices, and very often features showcasing Gernsback's own fertile, if sometimes rather eccentric, inventive imagination. And Gernsback the inventor was every bit as prolific and visionary as Gernsback the publisher and science fiction enthusiast. He held numerous patents for a wide array of devices, often aimed at solving what he perceived as the pressing problems of modern life, or at least providing a wonderfully futuristic, if occasionally deeply impractical, technological tweak to everyday existence. His inventions ranged from improved dry batteries and radio components to more outlandish concepts like a combined electric hairbrush and comb, or a sort of early personal radio device called the radio fought. If there was a perceived problem, Hugo Gernsback was likely already sketching out a gadget for it in his notebook, usually involving a pleasing number of exposed wires, a faint crackling smell of ozone when activated, and a very high probability of making the user look utterly magnificently ridiculous while employing it. The extent to which Hugo Gernsback's more peculiar or seemingly impractical inventions, such as the Isolator helmet, which we are about to explore in more detail, were genuinely intended by him as serious, potentially marketable products designed for widespread adoption, versus serving primarily as provocative, attention-grabbing illustrations of scientific concepts or imaginative solutions in his popular science magazines to stimulate reader interest, spark debate, and perhaps even boost circulation, is a topic sometimes discussed by historians of technology and popular science. He was, after all, a consummate showman and a brilliant popularizer, and he understood the appeal of the novel, the startling, and the slightly bizarre. The Isolator helmet, which he unveiled to the world in the pages of Science and Invention magazine in 1925, fits perfectly into this Gernsbackian pattern. It was a direct, if somewhat extreme, technological response to that very 1920s problem we've been discussing: the overwhelming cacophony and distraction of modern urban life, and the perceived difficulty of achieving sustained concentration for focused work. Gernsback, ever the pragmatist at least, in his own inventive logic saw a problem: too much noise, too many visual interruptions, and he engineered a solution: a personal wearable sensory deprivation chamber for your head. The Isolator helmet kind of looks like something a particularly dedicated character from one of his own science fiction stories would nonchalantly wear, probably, while trying to meticulously calculate the precise trajectory of a newly discovered rogue asteroid on a very complicated, oversized slide rule, all while remaining completely and blissfully oblivious to the fact that they're highly intelligent. Genetically modified Space Cat is subtly attempting to unplug their life-sustaining oxygen tank out of sheer, unadulterated feline boredom. His own science fiction writing, particularly the aforementioned Ralph 124C41+, the title itself being a wonderfully futuristic pun, Ralph 124C for 1, or Ralph 124C for 1, is famous, or perhaps infamous, for its relentless barrage of technological predictions. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this 1911 novel, while often criticized for its rather wooden characters and somewhat clunky plot, uncannily foreshadowed a surprising number of later inventions, including radar television video calls. Gernsback called them telephots, solar energy panels, synthetic milk, and food tape recorders, and even early concepts of spaceflight and fluorescent lighting. Given this track record of imagining future technologies, It's not surprising that his real-world inventions often carried a similar, futuristic, slightly fantastical, and occasionally rather over-engineered vibe. Hugo Gernsback, then, was a man living comfortably and often quite prophetically on the very blurry border between scientific fact and imaginative fiction. He saw the noisy, distraction-filled world of the Roaring Twenties not just as a source of stress, but as a challenge to be met with ingenuity, with technological optimism, and perhaps with a very large, very soundproof, and slightly intimidating wooden helmet. The stage was set, the problem was identified, and the uniquely Gernsbackian solution was about to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting and largely unhelmeted world. You're now acquainted with the irrepressible Hugo Gernsback Ageria, that larger-than-life impresario of science fiction, publisher of thrilling electrical experiments for the home enthusiast, and a man whose inventive mind seemed to operate on a slightly different, more eccentrically wired frequency than most. We've also painted a rather vivid, if somewhat noisy, picture of the Roaring Twenties, an era bursting with new sounds, new technologies, and a palpable sense of accelerated modern life. Now, to truly understand why a man like Gernsback would devote his considerable energies to designing something as utterly peculiar as a personal sensory deprivation helmet, we need to delve a little deeper into the perceived concentration crisis of his time, the very problem that the Isolator was intended, however, bizarrely to solve. It might seem strange to us now living as we do in an age of perpetual digital distraction, where our smartphones buzz with notifications every 30 seconds, and the internet offers an infinite glittering smorgasbord of things to click on, that people in the 1920s could possibly feel overwhelmed or unable to concentrate. But the truth is, the feeling of being bombarded with too much information, too much noise, and too many stimuli is not an exclusively 21st century affliction. People in the 1920s were starting to feel like their brains were constantly being filled with a chaotic chorus of noisy, enthusiastically Charleston dancing squirrels, making quiet contemplation or focused work an increasingly challenging endeavor. I just want to sit down and peacefully read this fascinating new monograph on advanced turnip cultivation techniques. A frustrated 1920s intellectual might sigh. But my mind keeps inexplicably wandering off to think about the latest jazz tunes. The scandalous length of modern flapper dresses and whether that newfangled home radio set will ever play anything other than slightly distorted static and suspiciously upbeat advertisements for revolutionary hair tonics and liver pills. A mainstream historical fact is that the early 20th century, particularly the post-World War I era that ushered in the Roaring Twenties, saw a significant increase in public discourse and even medical concern about the perceived negative psychological impacts of rapid modernization, urbanization, and relentless technological advancement. Terms like nervousness, nerve strain, or even neurasthenia, a diagnosis more common in the late 19th century but whose underlying anxieties persisted, were often used to describe a pervasive sense of mental fatigue, overstimulation, and a diminished capacity for sustained attention and deep concentration, all seemingly brought on by the increasingly demanding pace and sensory richness of modern life. Consider the sheer acceleration of information flow. Daily newspapers were cheap and ubiquitous, filled with ever more sensational headlines. A profusion of new magazines, including Gernsback's own popular science and fiction publications, vied for readers' attention. The radio, a magical new invention, was beginning to bring news music and advertisements directly into people's homes, creating a new layer of auditory environment, whether you wanted it or not. Early cinema, even in its silent days though, rarely truly silent, as we know, offered potent new forms of visual storytelling and escapism, drawing vast audiences. The telephone, while not yet in every home, was becoming an increasingly common fixture in businesses and more affluent households, bringing with it the potential for instant and sometimes unwelcome interruption. Urban density itself contributed to the feeling of overload. Cities were growing at an unprecedented rate, bringing more people into closer, often noisier proximity. The workplace, too, was changing. The rise of large office environments, with their clattering typewriters, ringing telephones, and the general hubbub of many people working in shared spaces, presented new kinds of distractions for those engaged in clerical or intellectual labor. The very efficiency and productivity that modern industry and commerce demanded also put a new premium on focused, uninterrupted work. Distraction was increasingly seen not just as an annoyance, but as an enemy of progress, a barrier to achieving one's full potential, whether in science, business, or the arts. It's kind of comforting in a slightly perverse, historically universal sort of way to know that people 100 years ago were also utterly convinced that the world was becoming far too loud and that they couldn't possibly get anything truly important done with all the infernal racket. They just happened to blame the incessant tooting of the Model T Ford outside their window instead of the relentless pinging of TikTok notifications on their phone. The desperate existential struggle for a quiet 5 minutes to actually think, it seems, is an eternal human condition. Hugo Gernsback, as a publisher, an editor, an inventor, and a man deeply immersed in the worlds of science and technology, was acutely aware of these pressures. In his writings, he often extolled the virtues of focused thought, of uninterrupted mental labor as being essential for scientific discovery, technological innovation, and creative problem-solving. He saw the increasing noise and visual clutter of modern life as direct impediments to this kind of deep work. He believed that the human mind, to operate at its peak efficiency, needed a sanctuary, a way to screen out the relentless barrage of external stimuli. Of course, people had always sought ways to find quiet and focus. They closed doors, retreated to libraries or private studies, put up metaphorical and sometimes literal "do not disturb" signs. There were philosophical and lifestyle movements, echoes of 19th century romanticism, and perhaps that advocated for simpler living. A return to nature, or the cultivation of inner stillness through practices like meditation, though that wasn't as mainstream in the West then as it is now. But Gernsback's approach, true to his nature, was characteristically almost gloriously technological. If noise and visual distraction were the problem, then surely the solution lay in inventing a device, a clever piece of personal apparatus that could physically block them out. Before our modern era of life coaches and mindfulness apps, you had the dedicated efficiency experts of the 1910s and 20s. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of these early proponents of scientific management and personal productivity advocated for almost comically regimented daily schedules and meticulously optimized workspace setups to maximize concentration. This could involve precisely angled writing desks, elaborate color-coded filing systems for every conceivable piece of paper, and even prescribed deep breathing exercises to be performed at 30-minute intervals for enhanced mental clarity. Hugo Gernsback, one imagines, probably looked at these earnest efforts involving paperclip organization and synchronized inhalation and thought, "Paperclips breathing exercises, amateurs. I shall build a helmet, a magnificent, all-encompassing helmet of pure, unadulterated isolation." Whether the attention deficits and feelings of sensory overload, so frequently lamented in the popular and even medical discourse of the 1920s, represented a quantifiable neurological change in the human population due to the pressures of modernity, or if they were primarily a socio-cultural anxiety, a way of expressing unease and disorientation in the face of an unprecedentedly rapid pace of technological and social change, is a fascinating question that continues to resonate with contemporary debates about the cognitive and psychological effects of our own digital technology on our capacities for deep attention and focused thought. The language may change, from nerve strain to information fatigue syndrome, but the underlying human concern about our ability to concentrate in an increasingly stimulating world seems remarkably persistent. It was this perceived concentration crisis, this deeply felt need for a shield against the encroaching clamor of the modern age, that provided the fertile ground for Hugo Gernsback's inventive mind to germinate one of his most peculiar, most memorable, and ultimately most wonderfully unsuccessful creations: the Isolator. He saw a need, and he was about to offer a solution so singular, so audacious, that it would achieve a curious kind of immortality in the annals of eccentric inventions. The stage is now perfectly set, Aguirre. You're immersed in the roaring 20s, an era of unprecedented clamor and exhilarating distraction, a time when the very air seemed to vibrate with the frenetic energy of modernity. And you've met the man of the hour, the inimitable Hugo Gernsback, a visionary pioneer of science fiction, a tireless publisher of popular science, and an inventor whose mind was a veritable Niagara Falls of often brilliant, sometimes baffling, and occasionally downright bizarre technological ideas. He has identified the problem this new, noisy, fast-paced world is, in his view, actively conspiring against humanity's precious ability to concentrate, to engage in the kind of deep, focused thought necessary for invention for scholarship for any truly significant mental labor. So, what's a prolific inventor and self-proclaimed champion of scientific progress to do when faced with such a pervasive, insidious threat to intellectual productivity? Well, if you're Hugo Gernsback, you don't just suggest people try meditating or perhaps invest in some good quality earplugs. Oh no. You invent something bold, something helmet-shaped. Thus is born the peculiar and soon-to-be legendary, for all sorts of reasons, idea of the isolator. Gernsback, with his characteristic directness and his unwavering faith in technological solutions for human problems, approaches the concentration crisis head-on, or rather by encasing the head entirely. His reasoning as laid out in his publications is deceptively simple. What are the primary enemies of focused thought in this modern age? Unwanted sound and distracting visual stimuli. Therefore, to achieve true unadulterated concentration, one must simply eliminate these enemies. And what better way to do that than by creating a personal portable environment of almost total sensory KO? A mainstream historical fact is that Hugo Gernsback did indeed conceive and formally patent the isolator in the year 1925. He presented it with genuine earnestness as a device specifically designed to increase concentration and enhance productivity by effectively eliminating all, or at least most, external auditory and visual distractions for individuals engaged in serious focused mental work. Imagine Gernsback perhaps sitting in his busy editorial office in New York City, the relentless sounds of traffic construction and the general urban hullabaloo filtering in through the window. He's trying, let's say, to edit a particularly thrilling installment of Ralph 124C 41+, or perhaps to pen an inspiring editorial about the wonders of atomic energy for Science and Invention magazine. Suddenly, a particularly loud klaxon horn from a passing fire truck shatters his train of thought, or a distractingly colorful advertising hoarding across the street catches his eye. That's it! You can almost hear him exclaim, a wild inventive glint appearing in his eye, a triumphant snap of his fingers. The distractions are external. Therefore, the solution must be an external barrier. I shall build a head fortress, a magnificent, impenetrable bastion of brainy solitude, a personal citadel of concentration. And thus, in a flash of Gernsbackian inspiration, or perhaps just profound annoyance, with a particularly persistent street peddler, the fundamental concept of the isolator was conceived. Whether Gernsback's core concept for the isolator was primarily influenced by nascent contemporary psychological theories about attention and the detrimental effects of distraction, emerging, if still very rudimentary, ideas about sensory deprivation, or perhaps more directly by his own prolific science-fictional imaginings of future human augmentation and specialized work environments, remains an intriguing point of interest for historians of invention technology and popular culture. His science fiction stories were often filled with characters using advanced technological aids to enhance their mental or physical capabilities. And the isolator, in many ways, feels like a device that could have stepped directly from the pages of one of his science fiction tales. The design brief for the isolator, as it began to take shape in Gernsback's mind, and perhaps in his initial sketches, was beautifully, if rather alarmingly straightforward. 1. Block out virtually all external sound. 2. Severely restrict the field of vision to only the immediate task at hand. 3. And, as a perhaps unintentional but ultimately unavoidable side effect, make the wearer look like a slightly bewildered deep-sea diver who has unfortunately lost a rather significant argument with a particularly aggressive woodpecker, or possibly a minor character from a very low-budget medieval siege movie who has fashioned some emergency protective headgear out of a sturdy wooden bucket. He seems to have nailed it on all three counts, particularly the third. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Gernsback's actual US patent for this device, patent number 1-552-700, which was filed on July 23, 1925 and officially granted on September 8, 1925, is titled, with a wonderful degree of formal, almost po-faced seriousness, "A helmet for facilitating concentration of the mind on a subject to the exclusion of other matters." The patent application itself goes on to describe in meticulous technical detail the construction and intended benefits of this remarkable piece of headgear, all without a hint of irony or any apparent awareness of its more visually challenging aspects. His optimism for this invention, at least in its initial presentation, seems to have been genuine. Gernsback truly believed in the power of technology to solve human problems and enhance human capabilities. He wasn't just creating a bizarre novelty item for a laugh, though laughter would indeed become a common reaction. He saw the isolator as a serious tool for what he termed brain workers. The writers, the scientists, the inventors, the students, the thinkers. Anyone whose profession or passion required long periods of uninterrupted, profound mental effort. In an increasingly noisy and visually cluttered world, he was offering them a personal sanctuary, a way to reclaim their focus, to dive deep into their thoughts, without the constant irritating tug of external distractions. This wasn't just a helmet for anyone you understand. This was a helmet for serious, dedicated, possibly slightly desperate brain workers. People whose thoughts were so monumentally profound, so potentially earth-shatteringly important, that they absolutely needed to be cocooned from the distracting presence of, say, a passing butterfly, the gentle rustle of a newspaper page turning in the next room, or the almost imperceptible sound of their own stomach rumbling from having forgotten lunch due to being so incredibly focused. Only the most dedicated, and perhaps as we will soon discover, the most surprisingly claustrophobic and oxygen-efficient thinkers need apply. The name itself, the Isolator, is perfectly Gernsbackian, direct, descriptive, and with a slightly futuristic scientific ring to it. He was, after all, a master at coining new terms from science fiction to television, a term he helped popularize, though he didn't invent the technology itself. The Isolator promised exactly what it said on its presumably very solid and soundproof tin isolation. Total or near-total isolation from the distracting sights and sounds of the Roaring '20s, all for the noble cause of deeper thought and enhanced productivity. The idea was born. The concept was patented. Now all that remained was to actually build this peculiar helmet and unleash its brain-boosting potential upon an unsuspecting and largely unisolated world. Hugo Gernsback, our intrepid inventor and champion of science fiction, has identified the problem the modern world of the Roaring '20s is just too darn noisy, too visually distracting for any serious brain worker to achieve proper, deep, uninterrupted concentration. His audacious solution, as we've seen, is not some gentle self-help technique or a polite request for colleagues to perhaps keep their Charleston practice to a dull roar. No, his answer is characteristically direct technological, and as it turns out, rather helmet-shaped. The Isolator idea, that personal head fortress of focused thought, has been conceived and even patented with due Gernsbackian seriousness. Now, Ageria, let us delve into the actual physical form of this remarkable and remarkably peculiar piece of early 20th century headgear. What did this helmet designed to silence the world and funnel the mind actually look like? Prepare yourself, because sleek and stylish are not words that readily spring to mind. A mainstream historical fact evident from the photographs and illustrations published in Gernsback's Science and Invention magazine in July 1925 is that the Isolator was a rather large, somewhat intimidating, and undeniably odd-looking contraption designed to completely encase the wearer's head and rest upon their shoulders. Imagine a very solid, almost blocky helmet, not unlike an extremely oversized squared-off thimble, or perhaps a heavily modified, deeply unglamorous version of a medieval jouster's great helm, but one that has clearly lost any aspiration towards chivalric elegance, and is instead channeling the aesthetic of a particularly stern and uncommunicative wooden crate. Putting on the Isolator was probably less like donning a sophisticated piece of cutting-edge scientific apparatus, and more like willingly, if somewhat apprehensively, inserting your entire head into a very small, very stuffy, custom-made personal wooden outhouse that just happened to have extremely poor window design and a lingering scent of well-intentioned but slightly misguided inventiveness. Fashion-forward it most certainly was not. The primary material for its construction was reportedly wood, chosen, one assumes, for its potential sound-dampening qualities and its relative ease of construction in a 1920s workshop. This wouldn't be a lightweight modern composite material. Think solid, probably fairly thick pieces of wood, carefully joined together to form the helmet's imposing structure. To further enhance its soundproofing capabilities, the interior was said to be lined with layers of felt cork, or other similar sound-absorbing materials. The aim was to create a barrier as impermeable as possible to the distracting cacophony of the outside world. The overall effect would have been quite heavy, resting squarely on your shoulders, making any sudden head movements a rather deliberate and carefully considered undertaking. No energetic nodding in agreement, or vigorous head-scratching and bemusement while wearing the isolator. Slow and steady was the only way to go, lest you inadvertently give yourself a mild case of Gernsback-induced whiplash. The precise materials used in the various layers and the exact internal construction details of the few isolator helmets that might have been actually built beyond Gernsback's initial prototypes or magazine mock-ups are not always extensively or consistently documented, leaving some lingering questions among historians of technology and Gernsback enthusiasts about their actual finished weight, the true level of interior comfort or profound lack thereof, and their genuine, scientifically measurable effectiveness in achieving the rather ambitious claimed levels of almost total sensory isolation. But perhaps the most striking and frankly most unsettling visual feature of the isolator was its approach to sight. If sound was one enemy of concentration, then distracting visual stimuli were clearly enemy number 2 in Gernsback's playbook. His solution, extremely tiny horizontal eye slits. We're not talking about a generous visor here, or even a pair of moderately sized goggles. No, the isolator featured 2 very small, very narrow, almost aggressively minimalistic, rectangular openings for your eyes, often described as being made of glass. These were positioned to allow you, the wearer, to see only a very limited, sharply defined field of vision directly in front of you, presumably your book, your notepad, or whatever piece of focused work you were engaged in. Anything in your peripheral vision, any distracting flicker of movement, any passing office colleague attempting to silently communicate the urgent need for a missing report via the medium of frantic interpretive dance would be entirely blotted out. The eye slits were so incredibly tiny, you could probably only clearly focus on a single word or perhaps a very small, well-behaved paragraph at any one time. It would certainly help you concentrate intently on that one specific word, mainly because you'd then have to spend the next 5 minutes carefully repositioning your entire helmeted head in a series of minute, painstaking adjustments just to locate the next word in the sentence. It was immersive reading Gernsback style, where immersive also meant mildly claustrophobic and potentially leading to a significant crick in the neck. The overall shape was often somewhat bell-like or domed at the top, flaring out to rest on the shoulders. There were no decorative flourishes, no concessions to aesthetic appeal. This was a purely functional device, its form dictated entirely by its intended purpose to isolate. And isolate it did. Imagine the experience of actually wearing it. The world outside would be dramatically muffled, reduced to a dull, distant thrum if the soundproofing worked as intended. Your own breathing would probably become an incredibly loud, almost oceanic roar within the confined felt-lined space. The smell would be an intimate blend of wood glue felt and your own increasingly stale exhalations. And your vision would be reduced to that tiny letterbox-shaped window onto the world, a world that now consisted solely of the page or object directly before your nose. It's easy to see why the design might be described as intimidating. There's something undeniably unnerving, almost a bit sinister, in a different sense about a human head completely encased in a solid, featureless block with only those tiny, glinting eye slits hinting at the living person within. It has a touch of the automaton, the faceless drone, or perhaps a particularly morose and introspective medieval executioner taking a quiet moment to himself before a busy day at the block. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the photographs published in Science and Invention magazine often showed Gernsback himself, or a suitably serious-looking model actually wearing the isolator, usually posed at a desk pen in hand, appearing to be deeply engrossed in profound intellectual labor. The wearers in these photos always look remarkably stoic and entirely unperturbed by the fact that they have a large, soundproof wooden box completely obscuring their head. This deadpan presentation, this genuine promotion of the device as a serious tool for brain workers, only adds to its wonderfully eccentric charm and historical peculiarity. Imagine trying to type a complex scientific paper design, a revolutionary new radio circuit, or even just write a vaguely coherent shopping list while encased in this thing. You'd be constantly bumping your helmeted head against your desk lamp, knocking over your inkwell with an unseen elbow, and generally looking like a very confused and slightly top-heavy medieval knight who has unfortunately misplaced his horse, his lance, and possibly the better part of his peripheral vision and common sense. Productivity through extreme sensory deprivation, and perhaps a few minor helmet-induced contusions. This then was the physical reality of Hugo Gernsback's peculiar solution to the concentration crisis of the Roaring Twenties: a solid, sound-dampened, vision-restricting headpiece, a personal isolation chamber designed to silence the clamor of the modern world and allow the dedicated thinker to finally get some serious work done. The design was undeniably odd, perhaps even a little intimidating, but its purpose in Gernsback's inventive mind was entirely noble. You are now intimately acquainted, Egeria, with the rather formidable, if undeniably peculiar, physical form of Hugo Gernsback's 1925 invention, the Isolator. You've imagined its solid wooden construction, its felt-lined interior designed to hug your head perhaps a little too snugly for comfort, its shoulder-resting bulk, and those strikingly tiny, almost comically restrictive horizontal eye slits. It's a piece of headgear that certainly makes a statement. Though that statement might be less intellectual sophisticate at work, and more, I appear to have misplaced my deep-sea diving expedition and would appreciate directions to the nearest ocean, if you please. But beyond its rather startling appearance, what was the core promise, the raison d'etre of this magnificent, if mildly terrifying cranium cocoon? It was above all the allure of silence, the dream of achieving what Gernsback himself termed soundproofed serenity for the dedicated brain worker. In the pages of Science and Invention magazine, where the Isolator made its grand debut to an unsuspecting public, Hugo Gernsback made some rather bold claims about its auditory capabilities. A mainstream historical fact is that he confidently asserted that his invention would effectively eliminate at least 90 to 95% of all outside noises. Imagine that, Egeria, in the context of the Roaring Twenties we've just explored. That incessant clatter of the elevated train, the persistent honking of those newfangled automobiles, the blare of your neighbor's jazz phonograph, the enthusiastic shouts of children playing stickball in the street below your window. All of it, or at least the vast majority of it, would supposedly vanish the moment you lowered the isolator over your head. Gernsback promised that with this 90 to 95% noise reduction, you'd only be able to hear the really truly loud stuff. Like perhaps a nearby building spontaneously deciding to undergo percussive deconstruction. A particularly enthusiastic opera singer practicing their most window-shattering high C directly in your living room. Or maybe just the subtle, insistent, and increasingly desperate whispers of your own rapidly diminishing sanity from being voluntarily trapped inside a rather stuffy wooden head box for an extended period. The intended result of this profound sound reduction was, of course, unparalleled mental focus. By creating a personal haven of near-total silence, Gernsback believed the Isolator would free the mind from the constant barrage of auditory distractions that plagued modern life. With the ears effectively taken out of commission, your brain, he argued, could devote all its precious cognitive resources to the task at hand. Whether that was composing a symphony, drafting a complex legal brief, inventing the next world-changing gadget, or simply trying to get through a particularly dense chapter of advanced theoretical physics, without your mind wandering off to ponder what that intriguing clanking sound from the apartment upstairs might possibly be. The Isolator was specifically marketed as an aid for students struggling to study in noisy dormitories, for writers battling the distractions of a busy household, for inventors needing absolute quiet to nurture their fledgling ideas, indeed, for anyone whose work demanded sustained, deep concentration. The ideal user for the Isolator, one imagines, was someone who desperately needed to write their magnum opus on, say, the socio-economic implications of turnip farming in late medieval Pomerania, but whose immediate neighbors were currently hosting a non-stop 24-hour Charleston and ukulele marathon with enthusiastic audience participation. For such a beleaguered scholar, a slightly cumbersome oxygen-challenged wooden helmet probably seemed like a veritable gift from the ancient gods of quiet contemplation and productive solitude. What was the supposed science, or perhaps more accurately, the Gernsbackian pseudoscience, behind this remarkable claim of near-total soundproofing? The helmet's construction, as we've discussed, involved solid wood, which in itself would provide a degree of sound insulation. This was then, according to Gernsback's descriptions, to be lined with thick layers of felt cork or other similar sound-absorbing materials. The design aimed to create as complete a seal as possible around the wearer's head and shoulders, minimizing any gaps through which errant sound waves might sneak in. It was in essence an attempt to create a miniature anechoic chamber, a personal cone of silence for your head. Imagine for a moment Egeria actually donning the Isolator as Gernsback intended. You lower the heavy wooden dome over your head, settling it onto your shoulders. The world outside with its myriad noises would, if the claims were true, dramatically recede. The clatter of the city would fade to a distant, almost imperceptible murmur, or perhaps even achieve that blessed state of pure, unadulterated silence. The only sounds remaining would be the intimate internal ones, the soft whoosh of your own breathing, the rhythmic thud of your heartbeat, perhaps the faint, digestive gurgle of your lunch making its way through your system. For someone truly desperate for quiet, this initial sensation of profound auditory isolation might indeed feel like a form of serenity, a welcome cocoon insulating them from the intrusive clamor of the external world. But how effective could it really have been using only the materials and construction techniques available in 1925, the actual acoustic effectiveness of the isolator in achieving the impressively high levels of sound reduction claimed by Hugo Gernsback is of course exceptionally difficult to verify definitively today, as no original scientifically testable examples of the helmet are known to have survived in pristine, unaltered condition, leading modern assessments to rely primarily on contemporary descriptions, Gernsback's own patent specifications, and informed speculation based on the known acoustic properties of the materials likely used in its construction. While wood and felt would certainly muffle sound to some extent, achieving a 90 to 95% reduction across the entire audible spectrum seems, shall we say, rather optimistic. Low-frequency sounds in particular are notoriously difficult to block without very specialized materials, and construction and bone conduction would still transmit some vibrations directly to your inner ear. Furthermore, the very act of creating such a sealed-off environment introduces new auditory phenomena. In a truly silent space, the sounds of your own body, your breathing, your pulse, even the blinking of your eyelids or the subtle creak of your neck muscles, can become amplified and surprisingly distracting. So you put on the isolator, eagerly seeking that promised, soundproofed serenity that will allow you to finally finish your epic poem about the migratory patterns of the Patagonian toothfish. What you might actually get is the suddenly very loud, very intrusive, and slightly alarming muffled roar of your own blood pressure, the surprisingly distinct echo of your own private thoughts, mostly variations on the theme of, why on earth am I wearing this ridiculous stuffy helmet, and is it lunchtime yet? And the dawning, slightly disheartening realization that true mental serenity might actually require a bit more than just a very large, very ambitious, and possibly not entirely effective wooden hat. A quirky or fringe tidbit that places Gernsback's invention within a broader cultural context is that the early 20th century saw a burgeoning interest in mental efficiency and memory improvement courses. These often advocated for minimizing all forms of distraction, sometimes suggesting bizarrely specific study environments, complex mnemonic systems, or even rather peculiar dietary restrictions, all designed to enhance focus and optimize brain power. Gernsback's isolator, with its promise of technologically enforced concentration, fits quite comfortably within this wider, if sometimes rather eccentric, cultural zeitgeist of trying to scientifically manage and improve the performance of the human mind. Nevertheless, the core promise of the isolator was potent, unparalleled focus through the elimination of auditory distraction. It was a bold claim, a direct assault on one of the primary banes of the modern thinking individual. Whether the reality could ever live up to the promise, however, was another question entirely, one that would soon be complicated by another pressing and rather more fundamental human need, the ability to breathe. You are now in your imagination, Egeria fully ensconced within the rather unique embrace of Hugo Gernsback's isolator helmet. The heavy wooden dome rests upon your shoulders. The felt lining muffles the clamor of the roaring 20s to a distant, almost imperceptible thrum, and your vision is channeled through those tiny letterbox-like slits directly onto the page or task before you. Gernsback has promised you soundproofed serenity, a haven of near-total silence where your mind can achieve unparalleled levels of deep, productive focus, free from the incessant auditory distractions of the modern world. It sounds in theory like an absolute dream for any beleaguered brain worker struggling to hear themselves think. There's just one tiny, rather fundamental, and increasingly pressing little problem that Mr. Gernsback, in his initial zeal for auditory isolation, might have slightly overlooked the small matter of, breathing. As you sit there cocooned in your personal wooden head fortress, diligently attempting to concentrate on, say, the The finer points of quantum physics or the lyrical scansion of a particularly complex modernist poem, you might begin to notice the air within the helmet becoming a trifle stale, a bit close, perhaps even a little bit difficult to inhale with your usual effortless gusto. After all, the Isolator by its very design is intended to be a largely sealed unit to achieve that much vaunted 90 to 95% sound reduction. Unfortunately, a largely sealed wooden box placed snugly over one's head, while excellent for muffling the neighbor's saxophone practice, is not terribly conducive to the long-term unimpeded exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide that the human body tends to rather insist upon for continued optimal functioning. So, you finally achieve that blissful state of near-total silence inside your amazing Isolator. Wonderful. You can almost hear your own neurons firing with newfound clarity. Only one tiny, increasingly urgent problem: you also can't actually breathe very well. It turns out that soundproofed serenity can very quickly morph into slightly suffocating solitude if one isn't careful. Hugo Gernsback, being an inventor and a man of science, or at least scientifiction, was not one to be easily deterred by such minor physiological quibbles. He, or perhaps some early, slightly gaspy volunteer testers of the Isolator, must have quickly realized that prolonged use of the helmet in its purely passive sealed state could lead to some rather undesirable side effects, such as dizziness, headaches, a notable decline in cognitive function, and eventually the rather inconvenient state of unconsciousness, which, while technically a form of very deep distraction-free rest, wasn't entirely conducive to productive brain work. So what was his ingenious solution to this little ventilation hiccup? Did he incorporate a complex series of baffling air vents? Perhaps a miniature hand-cranked bellows system? Oh no, Egeria. Hugo Gernsback went for something far more direct, far more technologically assertive, and it must be said far more wonderfully cumbersome. His solution, as proudly featured in the Science and Invention article showcasing the Isolator, was the addition of a small, portable oxygen tank. Yes, you heard that correctly. A mainstream historical fact is that to address the critical issue of ventilation and prevent the unfortunate suffocation of the dedicated thinker within its confines, Hugo Gernsback's published design for the Isolator explicitly included a connection to a separate portable oxygen cylinder. A tube would run from this tank, presumably filled with life-giving, highly concentrated O2 directly into the helmet, providing the wearer with a steady supply of breathable air. Suddenly, your quest for quiet internal focus now involves a personal, external, and slightly alarming life support system. You thought the Isolator helmet alone was a strong, if somewhat eccentric, fashion statement. Wait until you accessorize it with the matching oxygen tank and the trailing rubber air hose. You now resemble nothing so much as a very studious, incredibly focused, and possibly slightly flammable early prototype for a Michelin Man astronaut who has unfortunately become detached from their main spaceship and is now attempting to finish their doctoral dissertation on the socio-economic impact of cosmic rays while tethered to a very small, very hissy metal canister. Libraries, one imagines, would be absolutely thrilled by this new, improved, and now actively gas-emitting ensemble. The actual efficiency, reliability, and indeed the safety of the rudimentary personal oxygen supply system proposed for the Isolator, particularly given the state of portable gas cylinder technology in 1925 and whether any intrepid users might have experienced unpleasant issues such as hypoxia due to an inconsistent supply, hyperoxia from too much pure oxygen, or even just a general discomfort due to CO2 buildup within the helmet's enclosed and not perfectly ventilated design, are pressing questions for which direct empirical user experience data is now entirely lacking, forcing reliance on Gernsback's own descriptions, the patent specifications, and our general knowledge of contemporary compressed gas technology, which was not always as refined or user-friendly as it is today. This addition of an oxygen tank, while solving one very pressing problem, undeniably added another layer of complexity and cumbersomeness to an already rather unwieldy device. The helmet itself was likely quite heavy, resting on the shoulders. Now the dedicated brain worker would also have to manage an external oxygen cylinder with its valves, its pressure gauge, if it even had one, that was easily visible to the helmeted user, and its connecting tube, which could easily get snagged or tangled. It hardly seems like a recipe for relaxed, effortless concentration. Nothing quite says, "I am now entering a state of serene, deeply productive, uninterrupted intellectual contemplation," like the constant, faint, slightly anxious hiss of an oxygen valve right next to your ear and the nagging subconscious worry that your personal, life-sustaining air supply might unexpectedly run out. Mid-paragraph, transforming your previously profound thoughts on the nature of existence into a rather more urgent monosyllabic must find more air kind of internal vibe. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that early illustrations or photographs of the Isolator in Gernsback's magazine sometimes tend to gloss over the oxygen tank or depict it as a very neat, almost stylishly unobtrusive little cylinder, perhaps artfully tucked away beside the user's chair. The reality of lugging around, setting up and managing even a small 1920s-era compressed oxygen tank and its associated rubber tubing while simultaneously trying to immerse oneself in focused study or creative invention would likely have been far from serene or unobtrusive. It adds a certain steampunk, mad scientist laboratory aesthetic to the whole endeavor, which, while visually interesting for us now, is probably just another layer of faff for the would-be user then. Hugo Gernsback's persistence in presenting the Isolator as a viable tool, even with this added layer of oxygen-fueled complexity, speaks volumes about his unwavering belief in the power of technology to overcome any obstacle, and perhaps also just possibly a slight detachment from the more mundane practicalities of everyday user experience. He had identified the problem of noise and distraction. He had identified the subsequent problem of potential asphyxiation, and for each he had proposed a direct if somewhat extreme technological fix. The Isolator was now in theory a completely closed system, a tiny personal artificially respirated micro-environment designed for pure, unadulterated thought. The only things left to distract you now were the weight of the helmet, the extreme tunnel vision, the faint smell of wood, and felt the gentle hiss of oxygen and the ever-present low-level anxiety about whether that oxygen tank was about to run dry. Serenity achieved terms and conditions, and a reliable oxygen supplier may apply. Alright, Agaria. You are now in our shared imaginative journey into the Roaring Twenties, fully kitted out in Hugo Gernsback's rather unique vision of a personal concentration aid. The heavy, sound-dampening wooden Isolator helmet rests upon your shoulders, its felt lining creating a surprisingly intimate, if somewhat stuffy, microclimate around your head. The outside world, with its incessant jazz rhythms, its clattering streetcars, and the general exuberant din of modern life has, according to Gernsback's ambitious claims, faded to a distant, almost imperceptible whisper, perhaps achieving that promised 90 to 95% reduction in auditory assault. And most crucially, for your continued ability to ponder the deeper meanings of, say, advanced thermodynamics or the symbolism in modernist poetry, you are also connected via a delicate rubber tube to your own personal life-sustaining oxygen tank, ensuring that your quest for profound intellectual focus doesn't inadvertently culminate in a rather less profound state of simple asphyxiation. It's all very immersive. But Hugo Gernsback, in his relentless pursuit of the ultimate distraction-free environment for the dedicated brain worker, knew that sound was only one of the insidious enemies of concentration. Even in a perfectly silent room, the human eye, that curious, restless organ, has a tendency to wander. A flickering gas lamp in your peripheral vision, an intriguing pattern in the wallpaper, a particularly energetic dust mote dancing in a stray sunbeam. Even the sight of your own hands idly fiddling with a pen. All these, in Gernsback's view, were potential saboteurs of deep thought, insidious visual sirens, luring your precious attention away from the noble task at hand. And so, the Isolator had to address not just what you heard, but also what you saw. His solution to this visual vagrancy was as direct, as uncompromising, and as wonderfully peculiar as his approach to sound, the infamous and incredibly tiny eye slits. A mainstream historical fact clearly evident in all surviving photographs and illustrations of the Isolator is that a key and utterly defining design feature of this remarkable helmet was its provision for an extremely limited and severely restricted field of vision. There was no expansive visor offering a panoramic view of your workspace. Instead, the wearer peered out at the world through two very small, narrow horizontal slits, usually described as being fitted with pieces of glass. These were positioned directly in front of your eyes, their size and shape meticulously calculated. One assumes with Gernsbackian precision to allow you to see only the immediate area of your work. The page of the book you were reading, the sheet of paper you were writing on, the scientific apparatus you were minutely adjusting. and absolutely nothing else. Your field of vision edge area, while ensconced within the isolator, would be approximately the size of a particularly ungenerous and possibly slightly smudged postage stamp. You could see your work and only your work. The approaching zombie apocalypse happening just outside your study window, blissfully unaware. The inquisitive spider diligently brewing a tiny cup of tea on the corner of your desk, using a thimble and a dewdrop, entirely missed. Even your own hands would be largely invisible unless they were performing a task directly within that tiny prescribed rectangle of permitted visual reality. The intended effect of this pinhole perspective, as Gernsback would have explained it in the pages of Science and Invention, was to achieve a state of hyper-focus. By ruthlessly eliminating every extraneous visual stimulus by blocking out the irrelevant visual noise of your surroundings, your mind, he theorized, would be inexorably channeled with an almost laser-like intensity solely onto the object of your study. The rest of the room, the distracting piles of unanswered correspondence, the half-finished perpetual motion machine in the corner, the slightly judgmental portrait of your great-aunt Mildred, would effectively cease to exist, at least visually. Your brain, freed from the burden of processing unnecessary peripheral data, could then devote its entire magnificent capacity to the intellectual task at hand. It's like giving your eyes a pair of extremely severe custom-fitted blinkers, but in full all-encompassing helmet form. Now, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, and one that really underscores Gernsback's almost fanatical dedication to eliminating every conceivable visual distraction, suggestion that the small glass panels in these eye slits could be further modified for even more intense focus. He proposed that the inside of the glass could be painted black, leaving only a tiny, clear, horizontal line. This, he argued, would force the eye to read line by line, preventing it from even skipping ahead on the page or being distracted by illustrations or footnotes. It's like a form of technologically enforced high-intensity, single line at a time forced march reading. No peeking at the next paragraph to see if the plot improves. No quickly glancing at the pretty pictures before you've diligently absorbed the accompanying text. Just you, your isolator, and that single, relentlessly advancing, individually presented line of pure, unadulterated, and inescapable knowledge. Or, perhaps just your weekly grocery list now rendered with the profound gravitas of a Dead Sea Scroll. The potential psychological and physiological effects of such extreme and prolonged visual field restriction as that imposed by the isolator, and whether it would genuinely enhance focused attention and cognitive performance as Gernsback claimed, or inadvertently induce other unwelcome cognitive burdens, such as increased eye strain, mental fatigue, disorientation, or even heightened anxiety due to the loss of situational awareness, are fascinating questions that modern cognitive science or ergonomics might explore. Though, of course, direct empirical testing on the original, fully functioning 1920s device is regrettably no longer possible. Imagine Egeria, the actual experience of trying to work for any length of time with this incredibly limited pinhole perspective. The extreme tunnel vision would likely be quite disorienting, perhaps even inducing a mild sense of claustrophobia, adding to the already rather close atmosphere within the helmet. Reading a book might involve a constant, minute shifting of your entire heavy helmeted head to scan each line, then a more significant movement to find the beginning of the next. Writing would be a similar challenge, trying to keep your pen and paper within that tiny, visible rectangle. And what about situational awareness? Wearing the isolator effectively grants you incredible laser-like focus on your immediate work, and concurrently absolutely zero awareness of anything else happening in your immediate vicinity. You could be deeply engrossed in composing your Nobel Prize-winning treatise on the migratory patterns of the Patagonian dust mite, while entirely unknown to you, a flock of particularly bold pigeons decides to build a substantial nest on top of your helmet. Your trousers spontaneously combust due to a forgotten cigarillo, and a small but determined marching band quietly sets up and begins to play a spirited, if slightly muffled rendition of Yes, We Have No Bananas right behind your chair. You'd be blissfully, if only temporarily, unaware of all these minor external occurrences. Peak concentration achieved, though possibly at the cost of your trousers and your immediate social dignity. This drastic approach to managing visual input perfectly encapsulates Hugo Gernsback's inventive philosophy. Identify the problem, visual distraction, and then devise a direct physical technological barrier to eliminate it, with perhaps slightly less emphasis on the nuanced complexities of human comfort, practicality, or the inherent weirdness of the resulting device. The tiny eye slits of the Isolator were his uncompromising answer to the wandering eye, a determined effort to force the human gaze and, by extension, the human mind into a state of singular, unwavering focus, even if it meant the world beyond that tiny rectangle of glass momentarily ceased to exist. You are now, Egeria, fully briefed on the rather extraordinary design specifications of Hugo Gernsback's 1925 marvel of mental fortification, the Isolator. You've envisioned its solid wooden shell, its sound-muffling felt lining those charmingly tiny, vision-constricting eye slits, and of course that absolutely essential, if somewhat cumbersome, personal oxygen tank designed to prevent the dedicated brain worker from inadvertently achieving a state of terminal rather than merely profound concentration. The helmet in all its peculiar glory has been conceived, patented, and presumably at least one working prototype has been lovingly, if perhaps somewhat roughly, assembled in Gernsback's workshop. Now it's time for this marvel of modern thought enhancement technology to make its grand public debut. And where better for such an unveiling than in the pages of Gernsback's very own flagship publication for the discerningly inventive and scientifically curious Science and Invention magazine. A mainstream historical fact is that Hugo Gernsback did indeed introduce the Isolator to the world in a feature article in the July 1925 issue of Science and Invention. This wasn't some obscure, buried-in-the-back patent announcement. It was a proper showcase, complete with photographs, diagrams, and Gernsback's characteristically enthusiastic and optimistic prose, all designed to present his creation as a serious practical solution to that vexing modern problem of distraction. Imagine Egeria being a loyal subscriber to Science and Invention back in the summer of 25. You eagerly await your monthly dose of technological wonders articles on how to build a better crystal radio set, thrilling accounts of new electrical discoveries, and perhaps a speculative piece on the exciting future of rocket travel to Mars. You settle into your favorite armchair, eagerly flipping through the freshly printed pages, and then bam, there it is. Probably a multi-page spread, adorned with bold headlines and slightly stark black and white photographs. The Isolator, a new device to aid concentration. The title might scream, or perhaps something even more Gernsbackianly direct like, silence your senses, supercharge your synapses. The amazing Isolator helmet guarantees uninterrupted thought. You're intrigued, you're confused, you're possibly just a little bit concerned for Mr. Gernsback's current stress levels and his apparent access to rather large quantities of wood and felt. Gernsback, as the inventor and the magazine's editor, would have penned the accompanying article with his usual boundless enthusiasm and unwavering belief in the power of technology to improve human life. He would have laid out the problem, the incessant noise of modern city living, the myriad visual distractions, the resulting difficulty in achieving the deep, sustained focus necessary for intellectual breakthroughs or creative endeavors. He would have spoken directly to his target audience, the student, struggling to memorize their Latin declensions. Amidst the clatter of a busy dormitory, the writer desperately trying to meet a deadline while their neighbors practice the ukulele, with more passion than skill. The inventor striving to perfect their revolutionary new automatic potato peeling machine, but constantly being sidetracked by passing butterflies or interesting cloud formations. Gernsback's article probably read something like this. Are you, esteemed reader, a dedicated brain worker constantly besieged by the infernal cacophony of the 20th century? Do the distracting sights and sounds of our otherwise glorious modern age prevent your magnificent intellect from achieving its full world-changing potential? Fear not, for I, Hugo Gernsback, have corrected the solution. Behold, the Isolator. A triumph of scientific acoustic engineering and ophthalmological restriction, oxygen tank ability to withstand minor public ridicule, and a very understanding spouse, all sold separately. Terms and conditions may apply. The article would have meticulously and with great scientific seriousness detailed the Isolator's construction and its intended benefits. It would explain the sound dampening properties of the solid wood shell and its thick felt or cork lining, confidently asserting that 90 to 95% of all external noise would be effectively eliminated. It would extol the virtues of the tiny, precisely positioned eye slits, explaining how they restrict the user's vision solely to the immediate task at hand, thereby banishing all peripheral visual distractions. There would likely be diagrams cross-sections perhaps showing the layers of insulation, the path of the presumably fresh and invigorating oxygen from the auxiliary tank, and the precise angle of those vision-limiting eye holes. It would all be presented with an air of earnest problem-solving ingenuity. And then there would be the photographs. Oh, those wonderfully iconic photographs. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these images, often featuring Gernsback himself or a stoic, unnamed model, have become some of the most enduring and frequently reproduced visuals associated with eccentric inventions of the early 20th century. There's usually a gentleman dressed in the formal attire of the 1920s, seated at a desk pen, poised over paper, or eyes fixed on an open book, looking for all the world like he is engaged in the most profound and earth-shattering intellectual labor imaginable. And completely encasing his head, resting heavily on his shoulders, is the Isolator itself, that large, dark, featureless wooden helmet. Its tiny eye slits giving him the rather unnerving appearance of a particularly introspective deep-sea diver who has somehow found himself beached in a library, or perhaps a medieval knight who has misplaced his body but remains determined to finish reading his illuminated manuscript. The sheer deadpan seriousness of the model in these photos, resolutely ignoring the inherent visual absurdity of the contraption they are wearing, is a key part of the Isolator's unique and enduring charm. It's like they're trying to say, yes, I am aware that I currently have a substantial piece of acoustically engineered lumber completely obscuring my face, but my concentration levels, have I assure you, never been higher. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some very important, very isolated thinking to do. Whether Hugo Gernsback genuinely anticipated the somewhat comical and bewildered public perception that the Isolator might receive upon its unveiling, or if he was truly surprised and perhaps a little disappointed when his serious, scientifically conceived invention was met with more widespread amusement and skepticism than fervent orders and widespread acclaim, is a question that is difficult to definitively ascertain from this historical distance. Though his well-documented history as a consummate showman, a P.T. Barnum of popular science and technology, suggests that he was certainly not averse to attention-grabbing concepts and might have even welcomed a degree of notoriety as long as it drew readers to his magazines. Gernsback's intention in unveiling this marvel was undoubtedly multifaceted. He likely genuinely believed it could be a useful tool for those truly desperate for focus. He also knew that such a striking, unusual invention would generate buzz, get people talking, and sell magazines. And perhaps in his heart of hearts, as a science fiction visionary, he also saw it as a small step towards a future where humanity might increasingly need to employ technological aids to manage the ever-increasing sensory demands of an ever more complex world. So there it is, Igeria unveiled in the glossy pages of Science and Invention. July 1925, the Isolator. A helmet for deep thought. A personal sanctuary of silence and restricted vision. A testament to one man's inventive, if somewhat eccentric, response to the perceived concentration crisis of his age. The world has now seen it. The next question is, what did the world think of it? And perhaps more pressingly for our sleepy narrative, would any self-respecting 1920s library actually let you in the door wearing one? The public reaction, as you can probably imagine, was about to be interesting. The July 1925 issue of Science and Invention magazine has hit the newsstands Igeria, and within its pages, amidst articles on thrilling new radio circuits, the latest advancements in aviation, and perhaps a speculative piece on the feasibility of building a holiday resort on the moon. Hugo Gernsback has proudly unveiled his latest brainchild, the Isolator. You've seen the photographs. That stoic gentleman head entirely encased in the formidable wooden helmet, diligently attempting to engage in profound intellectual labor. You've read Gernsback's enthusiastic prose, his confident assertions about achieving 90 to 95% noise reduction and unparalleled mental focus. The marvel has been presented. Now, how does the world, that bustling, noisy, and often rather skeptical roaring 20s public, react to this peculiar proposition for soundproof serenity? Imagine yourself, Igeria, as an average, everyday reader of popular science magazines. In 1925, perhaps a curious office worker, a home hobbyist, or a student with an interest in the latest technological wonders, you eagerly pick up your copy of Science and Invention, anticipating some exciting new ideas. You flip through the pages past advertisements for build-your-own wireless sets and correspondence courses, in electrical engineering, and then you land on the feature article about the isolator. Your first reaction is likely one of sheer, unadulterated bewilderment. Readers of Science and Invention that month probably did a full-on coffee-spewing spit take right onto page 47. Well now, they might have spluttered, wiping Colombian gold blend from their spectacles. I was rather expecting another fascinating article on how to construct a miniature death ray from readily available household objects, or perhaps some helpful tips on improving the reception on my superheterodyne. But a fully enclosed, soundproof head bucket that also requires its own private oxygen bar. Hugo, my dear fellow, you've truly outdone yourself this time. Now, where do I most emphatically not go about purchasing one of these remarkable contraptions? The visual impact of the isolator as depicted in those stark black and white photographs cannot be overstated. It was, to put it mildly, profoundly strange. The sheer bulk of it, the complete obscuring of the human face, save for those tiny, almost sinister eye slits, the vaguely menacing, impersonal quality of the wooden shell. It was a far cry from the sleek, streamlined aesthetics that were just beginning to emerge in the Art Deco stylings of the era. For many, the initial reaction would surely have been amusement, perhaps even outright laughter. The image of a person willingly encasing their head in such a device to read a book or write a letter would have struck many as inherently comical, a piece of elaborate slapstick. Cartoonists of the day, had they widely picked up on it, would have had an absolute field day. Then there's the fear aspect mentioned in our outline. This might not be fear in the sense of mortal terror, but certainly a deep unease or apprehension. The idea of being so completely enclosed, so cut off from your surroundings, would undoubtedly trigger feelings of claustrophobia in many individuals. Some people, upon seeing the pictures of the isolator, probably thought with a little shiver, "Good heavens, is that some terrifying new type of advanced gas mask for fending off particularly boring university lectures, or perhaps the noxious fumes of my landlady's experimental cabbage soup? Or is it what happens when a deep-sea diver has a very unfortunate and aggressive disagreement with a particularly territorial family of woodpeckers?" Either way, a little bit unsettling, and not immediately suggestive of calm, serene contemplation. The addition of the oxygen tank, while a practical necessity to prevent, accidental self-asphyxiation in the pursuit of knowledge, would only have added to the vaguely alarming, almost medical or industrial feel of the apparatus. Beyond the initial visual shock and potential for nervous giggles, a healthy dose of skepticism regarding the isolator's claimed effectiveness would also have been prevalent. Could this rather homemade-looking wooden box truly block out 95% of all noise? How practical would it be to actually work for any length of time with your head in such a contraption, tethered to an oxygen supply peering out through those tiny slits? Would the supposed benefits of silence and visual restriction outweigh the undeniable discomfort, the restricted movement, and the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of the experience? The public, while often enthusiastic about new technologies in the 1920s, was also not entirely without its critical faculties. They probably looked at the isolator and thought, sure, it might block out the infernal racket of the jazz band practicing next door, but how on earth do I sip my tea? How do I politely answer the door if the nice young man from the telegraph office arrives with an urgent message? And most importantly, how do I maintain even a solitary shred of basic human dignity while wearing what appears to be a repurposed medieval torture device designed for exceptionally talkative parrots? A mainstream historical fact is that while Hugo Gernsback presented the isolator with earnest conviction as a serious invention, its subsequent public reception, as far as can be gauged from its profound lack of commercial success, its rapid descent into obscurity, and its frequent later inclusion in popular collections of bizarre or failed inventions, was likely one predominantly characterized by amusement, widespread skepticism, and perhaps a touch of gentle ridicule, rather than any significant adoption or critical acclaim as a practical device for enhancing concentration. The precise extent and specific nature of contemporary public discourse surrounding the isolator immediately following its 1925 publication are unfortunately rather difficult to fully reconstruct today due to the often ephemeral nature of much popular media commentary from that period, and the lack of dedicated market research for such niche inventions, leaving historians of technology to rely on its lasting legacy primarily as a famous eccentric or bizarre invention. which strongly suggests it captured a certain strand of the public imagination, albeit almost certainly not in the way Gernsback himself likely intended or hoped for. A quirky or fringe tidbit that puts the Isolator in a slightly different, though still rather peculiar light, is to consider the later development decades later in the mid-20th century of sensory deprivation tanks or flotation tanks. These were designed for relaxation meditation and psychological experimentation, aiming to reduce external stimuli to a minimum, while vastly different in form, comfort, and intended purpose. The Isolator was for active mental work, not passive relaxation. They share a distant conceptual ancestor with Gernsback's helmet in the fundamental idea of manipulating or drastically reducing sensory input to achieve a specific mental state. Gernsback was in his own unique way an early, if somewhat misguided pioneer in the field of personal sensory environment control. It's unlikely that Gernsback received a flood of enthusiastic orders for the Isolator following its debut. More probably, it became a minor curiosity, a topic of amused conversation among readers of science and invention, perhaps a symbol of just how far some inventors would go in their quest for a technological fix. The overwhelming public reaction, you can safely imagine Egeria, was one of puzzled bemusement, a collective scratching of unhelmeted heads, and a general consensus that while concentration was indeed a valuable commodity, perhaps encasing oneself in a soundproof wooden box with its own private oxygen supply was a slightly extreme and not entirely appealing price to pay for it. The laughter, the fear of claustrophobia if not of the helmet itself, and the profound skepticism were likely the dominant notes in the Isolator's public reception. The public debut of Hugo Gernsback's Isolator helmet in the pages of Science and Invention magazine has, as you can well imagine, Egeria caused less of a sensation of widespread acclaim and more of a ripple of bewildered amusement. Quiet chuckles and perhaps a few genuinely concerned letters to the editor questioning Mr. Gernsback's current stress levels. The striking photographs of a somber gentleman encased in that rather formidable wooden headpiece, diligently trying to concentrate while tethered to an oxygen tank, likely provoked more smiles than sales. While Gernsback presented his invention with earnest conviction as a serious tool for the dedicated brain worker, its inherent visual absurdity and questionable practicality meant it was destined to become more of a curious footnote in the annals of eccentric inventions than a must-have accessory for every aspiring scholar and thinker of the Roaring Twenties. Now let's turn our sleepy attention to that rather intriguing and wonderfully specific claim in our overall story title, the idea that the Isolator was banned from most libraries. This is a delicious detail conjuring up images of stern librarians' quiet pleas, signs being emphatically pointed at, and helmeted individuals being politely but firmly shown the exit. But was it actually literally banned? A mainstream historical fact is that public libraries in the 1920s, while increasingly seen as important democratic institutions for learning and self-improvement, were also places that maintained and often quite strictly enforced rules of decorum, silence, and appropriate conduct to ensure a conducive atmosphere for all patrons. Any device or behavior deemed overly disruptive, excessively conspicuous, potentially unsafe, or simply too bizarre for the prevailing social norms would almost certainly have been discouraged, if not outright prohibited, by vigilant librarians. While concrete archival evidence of widespread official, specifically worded Isolator helmet bans, formally issued by numerous specific libraries in the 1920s, is perhaps unsurprisingly rather elusive and difficult to pinpoint definitively. The overwhelming plausibility of such informal prohibitions, or at least very strong discouragement by librarians given the device's extraordinary and frankly rather alarming appearance, its cumbersome nature, and its potential for disrupting the quietude it aimed to foster for the wearer, is a very strong inference supported by our general understanding of contemporary library etiquette, institutional risk management, however nascent, and basic human social norms. It's less about finding a dusty, forgotten "No Isolator Helmets Allowed" sign, and more about understanding the unwritten rules of public space. Imagine the scene Egeria. You, as a hypothetical, deeply committed, and perhaps slightly socially oblivious Isolator enthusiast, decide to take your new concentration aid for a spin at your local public library. It's a haven of hushed tones, the gentle rustle of turning pages, the occasional polite cough. The perfect place, you think, to truly test the Isolator's amazing soundproofing capabilities and get some serious reading done on, say, the migratory patterns of the Patagonian guanaco. You stride confidently, or perhaps waddle slightly given the helmet's bulk, and your tethered oxygen tank through the imposing oak doors and into the hallowed halls of knowledge. The head librarian. A formidable individual, possibly a stern-faced matron, with spectacles perched precariously on her nose and an expression that suggests she could silence a barbarian horde with a single, well-aimed, bone-chilling glare, takes one look at you, your magnificent wooden head fortress, and your trailing, gently hissing oxygen cylinder. Her spectacles, one imagines, nearly launch themselves into low Earth orbit from sheer surprise and profound disapproval. Sir or madam, or, sentient deep-sea diving bell. She might begin her voice a low, dangerous rumble that nevertheless carries effortlessly across the otherwise silent reading room. That contraption you are currently sporting upon your person is, I regret to inform you, not entirely conducive to the scholarly atmosphere we endeavor to maintain herein, or frankly to my current blood pressure. What specific objections might a 1920s librarian have had to your beloved Isolator? Firstly, and most obviously, its appearance. It was large, it was intimidating, it looked utterly fantastically out of place amidst the quiet dignity of bookshelves and reading tables. It would be an undeniable and highly significant distraction to every other patron in the library, the very people who had come there seeking peace and quiet. Imagine trying to concentrate on deciphering an ancient Sumerian clay tablet, or perhaps just the latest thrilling installment of a boy inventor's adventure story, while sitting next to someone who appears to have a small, personalized wooden outhouse strapped to their head. It's less temple of silence and more unwitting participant in a very strange, avant-garde performance art piece that I most definitely did not sign up for when I got my library card. Secondly, despite its soundproofing claims for the wearer, the Isolator itself might not have been entirely silent to those nearby. The oxygen tank could hiss or gurgle. The wooden helmet itself might creak or make other strange noises if you, the wearer, shifted your position or, heaven forbid, tried to turn your head too quickly. The very act of donning and doffing such a cumbersome piece of equipment in a public space would likely be a disruptive process. Thirdly, space. Public libraries, then as now, often had limited desk space. You, Ageria, plus your Isolator, which added considerable bulk to your head and shoulders, plus your essential oxygen tank, and its associated tubing, would take up a rather disproportionate amount of precious communal table real estate. Other patrons forced to squeeze around your personal concentration encampment might not be entirely pleased. Fourthly, there are the potential safety and liability concerns, however rudimentary those might have been in the 1920s compared to today. A librarian would understandably be nervous about a patron completely encased in a wooden box reliant on a personal oxygen supply of uncertain vintage and reliability. What if you fainted from lack of air or an excess of CO2? What if you tripped over your oxygen tube while trying to navigate the stacks? What if the tank itself decided to leak, or in a truly worst-case scenario, experienced some kind of catastrophic failure? The potential for mishap and the librarian's responsibility for the well-being of all patrons would make the Isolator a decidedly unwelcome guest. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that early 20th century libraries often had very specific and sometimes quite amusingly detailed lists of forbidden behaviors posted for their patrons. These might include common sense things like no loud talking or no eating and drinking, but also more particular injunctions such as no loud or persistent whispering, no unnecessary rustling of newspapers. Gentlemen are requested to remove their hats, or even in some more fastidious institutions, perhaps no consuming of onions or other strongly odoriferous foodstuffs immediately prior to entering the library. The Isolator, with its sheer visual impact and its attached gas cylinder, would likely have inspired a whole new, very specific category of prohibition had it ever become common enough to warrant one. So while we may not find stacks of official Isolator helmet prohibition notices in library archives, the legend of it being banned from most libraries rings with a strong note of intuitive truth. It was quite simply too peculiar, too disruptive, too cumbersome, and too potentially problematic for the well-ordered, shared, and studious environment that libraries strove to maintain. The very quiet pleas, i.e. signs that adorned library walls, would seem to develop a whole new layer of existential dread and profound bewilderment when faced with the prospect of the Isolator. It's like the sign itself is thinking, I am doing my absolute best here to maintain a modicum of scholarly serenity, but how, pray tell, does one politely and effectively shush a walking, self-contained, oxygenated wooden phone booth who earnestly claims to be merely enhancing their powers of concentration for the betterment of all mankind? The irony is, of course, delicious. A device invented to facilitate quiet study in a noisy world was itself likely too loud. But in a visual and social sense, for the very temples of quiet study, it was theoretically designed to serve. You've now witnessed Ageria the rather frosty or at best bewilderedly amused reception that Hugo Gernsback's magnificent Isolator helmet likely received from the Roaring Twenties public, and particularly from the stern, order-loving guardians of its literary temples, the librarians. The dream of every serious brain worker striding confidently into their local library head encased in a personal wooden fortress of solitude, trailing a discreet oxygen tank and settling down for hours of uninterrupted super-productive thought seems to have remained firmly in the realm of Gernsback's more optimistic imaginings. The banned from most libraries legend, whether literally true in terms of official, widely circulated edicts, or more a reflection of its inherent unsuitability for such shared decorous spaces, highlights a fundamental truth. The Isolator, for all its inventive audacity, was plagued by a host of rather significant, one might even say, suffocating practical setbacks and fatal design flaws. Let's revisit that charming little addition, the personal oxygen tank. While a clever, if somewhat extreme solution to the very real problem of not being able to breathe inside a largely airtight wooden box, it introduced a whole new set of complications. A mainstream historical fact is that despite Hugo Gernsback's earnest intentions to create a device for enhanced concentration, the Isolator suffered from numerous significant practical design flaws that rendered it highly uncomfortable, unwieldy, and ultimately impractical for any kind of sustained productive use. The reliance on an external oxygen supply was chief among these. The portable oxygen cylinders of 1925 were not the sleek, lightweight, and highly reliable medical devices we know today. They would have been relatively heavy, cumbersome, and the technology for regulating a consistent, safe flow of pure oxygen for personal prolonged use was still somewhat rudimentary. There would be the constant nagging anxiety: is the tank full? Is the valve working correctly? What happens if it runs out while I'm in the middle of a particularly profound thought about the fourth dimension, or the mating habits of the Patagonian tree frog? The very thing designed to eliminate distraction could thus become a new and rather more existentially alarming source of it. And let's not forget the potential auditory contribution of the oxygen system itself. Nothing quite says serene, deep, scholarly concentration like the constant, faint, slightly ominous hiss of an oxygen valve right next to your ear, or the occasional disconcerting gurgle from the tank, subtly reminding you that your ability to continue thinking is entirely dependent on this slightly temperamental, gas-emitting metal canister you've now invited into your personal study space. Then there's the claustrophobia. Human beings, by and large, are not naturally inclined to enjoy having their heads completely encased in dark, confined, unyielding spaces for extended periods. The Isolator, with its solid wooden walls, its close-fitting felt lining, and its almost total lack of connection to the outside world, would have been an absolute nightmare for anyone with even a mild tendency towards claustrophobic unease. Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and try Hugo Gernsback's amazing Isolator helmet. Experience the truly unique and unforgettable sensation of being a very important, very studious letter, unfortunately trapped inside a very small, very dark, and increasingly rather stuffy wooden envelope. Claustrophobics, of course, need not apply. Or rather, they can certainly apply, but they probably won't enjoy the total sensory immersion and profound intellectual solitude experience quite as much as Mr. Gernsback optimistically envisioned. For many, the primary sensation inside the Isolator might not have been enhanced focus, but a rising tide of panic and an overwhelming urge to escape the wooden head prison. And what of those famously tiny eye slits designed to channel your vision with laser-like intensity onto your work? While the theory of blocking peripheral distractions might have seemed sound to Gernsback, the practical reality of peering at the world through two minuscule letterbox-shaped apertures for hours on end would likely lead to significant eye-strain headaches and a profound sense of visual frustration. Reading a book would involve a constant, minute and neck-achingly awkward series of head movements to scan each line. writing, or drawing would be a similar exercise in constrained effort. The loss of peripheral vision also means a complete lack of situational awareness. You wouldn't see if your tea was about to be knocked over by a stray elbow, your own most likely, as you wouldn't see it coming if a precarious pile of books was about to topple onto your oxygen tank, or if your cat had decided that the gently hissing oxygen tube looked like a fascinating new chew toy. The sheer physical discomfort of the device would also have been a major drawback. As we've established, it was likely made of solid wood and lined with felt resting heavily on the wearer's shoulders. Imagine the neck strain, the shoulder ache, after even an hour of supporting this weighty contraption. Good ergonomics were clearly not at the top of Gernsback's design priorities. Add to that the inevitable heat and stuffiness within the enclosed, poorly ventilated space. Even with the oxygen supply, air circulation would be minimal, and you have a recipe not for serene concentration, but for a rather sweaty, uncomfortable, and increasingly irritable brain worker. Since I started using Hugo Gernsback's revolutionary Isolator helmet, said absolutely no one ever, my productivity has soared to unprecedented heights, and I no longer suffer from distracting thoughts or an aching cranium. Mostly because I'm far too busy worrying if my personal oxygen tank is about to stage a dramatic and possibly explosive walkout, or if I'm in the process of developing a rare and entirely new form of advanced, helmet-induced neck ache that will surely baffle future medical science. The extent to which the Isolator was ever seriously prototyped, beyond a few initial demonstration models specifically created for Gernsback's magazine feature, or if any significant number of individuals genuinely attempted to use it for regular sustained work in their daily lives, is exceptionally unclear from the surviving historical record. Meaning that detailed assessments of its real-world user experience and its actual impact on concentration remain largely in the realm of informed speculation and humorous conjecture. It seems highly probable that its manifest impracticalities quickly relegated it to the status of a curious but ultimately unusable oddity. A quirky or fringe tidbit one might imagine is that any truly dedicated or perhaps deeply unfortunate user of the Isolator probably developed a unique set of very specific minor occupational injuries. Things like constantly bruised shins from repeatedly bumping into unseen desk legs, a perpetually stiff and aching neck from trying to angle those tiny eye slits just right to read the bottom line of a page, or perhaps even a slight permanent indentation around the shoulders from the helmet's considerable weight. Isolator elbow or Gernsback's gaze strain probably weren't among officially recognized medical conditions in the 1920s, but one feels with a certain degree of sympathetic historical certainty that they probably should have been. Ultimately, the Isolator, for all its inventive ambition, suffered from a classic case of the solution being arguably worse, or at least far more cumbersome and uncomfortable than the original problem. In its zealous quest to eliminate every conceivable external distraction, it introduced a host of new internal ones. Physical discomfort, claustrophobic anxiety, reliance on a hissing oxygen tank, and the sheer, unadulterated awkwardness of trying to function with a large wooden box on your head. The soundproofed serenity it promised likely remained an elusive dream lost somewhere between the desire for silence and the desperate need for a breath of fresh, untanked air and a slightly wider field of vision. The early user reviews for the Isolator, had they existed on some Bronze Age equivalent of Amazon back then, perhaps inscribed on easily breakable clay tablets, might have read something like this: 1 star. Extremely heavy. Smells faintly of existential despair and old unwashed socks. Eye slits perfectly designed to allow clear viewing of approximately 1 comma, or possibly a very small, well-behaved semicolon at any given time. Oxygen tank makes disconcerting gurgling noises reminiscent of a dying badger. Did not achieve enlightenment, make me a better inventor, or help me finish my tax returns. Would not recommend for focused study social gatherings, or frankly, any other conceivable human activity. The Isolator helmet Egeria, with its grand promises of soundproofed serenity and laser-like focus, has, as you've now gathered, largely failed to set the roaring 20s alight with its brain-boosting brilliance. Its inherent impracticalities, the cumbersome oxygen tank, the intense claustrophobia, the comically restrictive eye slits, and its general resemblance to a piece of repurposed medieval siege equipment, meant that it was probably met with more bewildered chuckles than enthusiastic purchase orders. It seems destined to become a curious footnote in the annals of well-intentioned, but ultimately rather misguided inventions. But was the Isolator a singular flash of peculiarity in an otherwise staid, inventive career for Hugo Gernsback? Or was it perhaps part of a broader pattern, a testament to a mind consistently buzzing with wonderfully eccentric, occasionally prescient, and frequently less than successful technological contraptions? Let's take a brief, sleepy peek into what else might have been brewing in Hugo Gernsback's metaphorical and possibly literal inventor's garage. A mainstream historical fact is that Hugo Gernsback was indeed a remarkably prolific inventor, holding numerous patents throughout his career. And he was a constant, enthusiastic promoter of new technological ideas, many of which he showcased with great fanfare in the pages of his popular science and science fiction magazines. While some of his conceptual predictions, particularly those in his science fiction writing, were astonishingly prescient, foreseeing television radar solar power and more, many of his specific gadget designs, like the Isolator, often tilted more towards the endearingly impractical or the delightfully eccentric, rather than achieving widespread commercial success or mainstream adoption. Hugo Gernsback's garage, one imagines, wasn't filled with mundane items like old lawnmowers, rusty bicycles, and forgotten paint cans. Oh no. It was probably crammed to the rafters with half-finished prototypes for thought-amplifying devices, slightly singed blueprints for personal anti-gravity belts, a very confused-looking automaton butler that only spoke in early and rather scratchy radio advertising jingles, and perhaps a small, cautiously optimistic herd of genetically engineered miniature zebras intended for urban commuting. It was in all likelihood a veritable wonderland of well-intentioned, if occasionally slightly alarming, inventive weirdness. The Isolator then was not an isolated incident of out-of-the-box, or in this case, on-the-head-box thinking. It was part of a larger oeuvre of Gernsbackian gadgetry. Consider, for example, his ideas for what he called radio spectacles, or tele-ye glasses. Decades before Google Glass or other modern augmented reality eyewear, Gernsback envisioned spectacles that could allow the wearer to receive and view television broadcasts directly, perhaps even projecting tiny images onto the lenses. Again, the core idea, personal portable visual media, was remarkably forward-thinking. The likely 1920s execution, however, probably involved a rather substantial backpack containing the necessary radio receiver and projection equipment, connected to the glasses by a thicket of wires, making the wearer look like a very studious cyborg insect. Fashionable perhaps in certain very niche, science fiction fan clubs, but unlikely to take the haberdashery world by storm. Then there was the ossiphone, a device Gernsback patented and promoted, designed to allow people with hearing impairments to hear, or rather to sense sound vibrations through their teeth. This intriguing contraption involved the user biting down on a rod or a specially designed earpiece connected to a sound source like a radio or phonograph. The sound vibrations would then be transmitted through the bones of the jaw and skull directly to the inner ear, a principle known as bone conduction. While the ossiphone itself didn't become a mainstream success, the underlying principle of bone conduction hearing is entirely valid and is used in some modern hearing aids and specialized communication headsets. So with the ossiphone, hear music directly through your teeth? It's a genuinely novel idea, and for some, it might have offered a new way to experience sound. Though you might get some rather strange looks at the opera if you're seen enthusiastically gnawing on your program, or perhaps a specially adapted ossiphone-compatible libretto stand in a desperate attempt to catch the soprano's thrilling high notes amidst the orchestral crescendo. Is he deeply moved by the aria? Your fellow opera-goers might whisper, or just exceptionally ravenously hungry for paper-based products this evening? We've also briefly mentioned his patented combined electric hairbrush and comb, a device presumably designed to bring the electrifying thrill of modern science directly to your morning grooming routine, though. Whether it actually improved one's coiffure or merely added a certain unexpected static charge and a faint smell of ozone to one's locks is a matter for historical speculation. The primary motivation behind Hugo Gernsback's relentless and often very public promotion of his frequently unusual and sometimes seemingly impractical inventions, whether it was driven by a genuine, unwavering belief in their potential, practical utility, and commercial viability, a more altruistic desire to popularize scientific thinking, and stimulate bold innovation in his vast readership or perhaps a shrewd publisher's innate understanding of how sensational, futuristic, or even slightly comical concepts could effectively boost magazine sales and cement his own reputation as a technological visionary, is a fascinating question that invites continued interpretation of his multifaceted and undeniably colorful career. Another wonderfully Gernsbackian concept he promoted was the hypnobioscope, a device intended for learning during sleep. Imagine a machine that would play recorded lessons or information through a pillow speaker or gentle headphones while you slumbered, the knowledge supposedly seeping directly into your subconscious mind. Learn French while you dream master calculus without ever consciously cracking a textbook. Wake up fluent in advanced Martian linguistics and ready to negotiate interplanetary trade deals. Side effects may include an inexplicable craving for cheese, a tendency to mutter complex equations in your sleep, and the occasional dream featuring very polite, multi-tentacled extraterrestrial customs officials. It was the ultimate passive learning tool, a technological shortcut to erudition. Though its actual effectiveness, much like the Isolator's, was probably more in the realm of hopeful theory than proven practice. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Gernsback once even proposed a remarkably prescient system for what he called teledoctoring. He envisioned patients being diagnosed remotely by physicians, using a combination of electrical instruments to transmit vital signs and early television technology to allow for visual examination, a very, very early conceptual precursor to modern telemedicine. Of course, his proposed methods for, say, remotely diagnosing a case of the sniffles probably involved more crackling electrodes, buzzing coils, and fuzzy ghost-like images on a tiny cathode ray tube screen than your typical modern Zoom call with your GP, but the core idea of remote healthcare was undeniably there, bubbling away in his ever-inventive mind. What all these wonderfully eccentric contraptions, the Isolator, the radio spectacles, the ossiphone, the hypnobioscope, have in common is Hugo Gernsback's signature blend of visionary foresight, technological optimism, a flair for the dramatic, and perhaps a slight charming disconnect from the mundane practicalities of everyday human comfort and social convention. He saw a problem or an opportunity for improvement, and his mind immediately leaped to a gadget, often a rather complex and visually striking one. The Isolator, with its promise of focused thought in a noisy world, was a perfect Gernsbackian solution, direct, ambitious, and utterly unforgettably peculiar. It may not have been banned from libraries due to being too effective, but rather because it was just too Gernsback. You've now taken a rather delightful, if slightly bewildering, detour through Hugo Gernsback's metaphorical inventor's garage Egeria, peeking at some of his other wonderfully eccentric and occasionally quite prescient contraptions, from radio spectacles to the tooth-buzzing ossiphone and the dream-learning hypnobioscope. This brief tour of Gernsback's wider inventive landscape helps to place the Isolator helmet within its proper context, not as a singular inexplicable aberration, but as a rather characteristic product of a mind that was constantly, restlessly, and often quite strangely grappling with the perceived problems and technological possibilities of the modern age. But what became of the Isolator itself after its brief, much-photographed debut in the pages of Science and Invention magazine in that noisy summer of 1925? Did it, despite its rather significant practical flaws and its somewhat challenging aesthetic, go on to revolutionize the world of focused thought? Did brainworkers across the globe clamor to encase their heads in its soundproofed, oxygen-fed embrace? Well, Egeria, as you might have already gently surmised from our discussions of its cumbersome oxygen tank, its severely restricted vision, its potential for inducing acute claustrophobia, and its general resemblance to a piece of repurposed medieval siege equipment that has had an unfortunate encounter with a woodworking enthusiast. The Isolator did not exactly take the Roaring Twenties by storm. Its peculiar story, after that initial flurry of magazine-based publicity, largely faded into a rather quiet obscurity, becoming less a widely adopted tool and more a curious, almost legendary footnote in the voluminous history of well-intentioned, but ultimately unsuccessful inventions. The Isolator's market share, one imagines, was probably nestled somewhere comfortably between that of left-handed smoke shifters and solar-powered submersible raincoats. It wasn't exactly flying off the shelves of your local 1920s department store, nor was it likely a hotly requested item in the annual Sears, Roebuck & Comedy catalog. Most people, when hypothetically offered the choice between a giant stuffy wooden head bucket with its own private, slightly hissy oxygen bar, and say just trying a stronger cup of coffee and perhaps politely asking their neighbors to practice their trombone solos at a slightly more sociable hour, understandably opted for the latter. After its moment in the science and invention spotlight, the Isolator seems to have quietly vanished from public consciousness, at least in its own time. There's no evidence that it was ever mass-produced or achieved any kind of commercial viability. A mainstream historical fact is that Hugo Gernsback's Isolator helmet, despite the inventor's enthusiastic promotion in his widely read magazine, failed to achieve any discernible commercial success or widespread adoption by its target audience of brain workers. It quickly faded from view and is primarily remembered today, when it is remembered at all, as a striking and rather comical example of early 20th century eccentric invention, a testament to a bold idea undone by its profound impracticality. The precise number of Isolator helmets ever actually constructed, whether it remained essentially a single lovingly crafted, if somewhat misguided prototype used for the magazine photographs, perhaps a very limited run of demonstration models for display at a technology exhibition or in Gernsback's own offices, or if any were ever genuinely sold to a few exceptionally intrepid and noise-sensitive individuals, is unfortunately unknown from the surviving historical record. As Gernsback's company, records for such minor, non-commercialized, and inventive ventures are not comprehensive enough to provide definitive figures. It's quite possible that the very few Isolators that ever existed now reside only in those iconic photographs, or perhaps as disassembled components in a dusty, forgotten corner of an inventor's archive. Why did this marvel become such a swiftly forgotten novelty, such an obscure footnote? The reasons, as we've explored, are manifold and almost entirely practical. The sheer weight and cumbersomeness of a solid wood and felt helmet resting heavily on the shoulders would have been uncomfortable for any prolonged period. The intense claustrophobia induced by being completely encased in a dark, confined space would have been unbearable for many. The reliance on a rudimentary and potentially unreliable 1920s portable oxygen tank, with its hissing valve and trailing tube, added a layer of anxiety and awkwardness rather than serenity. And those tiny, vision-restricting eye slits, while theoretically eliminating visual distractions, would have made practical tasks like reading across a full page taking notes, or even just finding your teacup an exercise in profound frustration and neck-craning contortion. Ironically, for most people attempting to use the Isolator, would likely have been more distracting and less conducive to focused thought than simply enduring the everyday noises of the 1920s. Hugo Gernsback himself, a man of boundless energy and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of new ideas, likely moved on fairly quickly to his next invention, his next publishing venture, his next thrilling vision of the science-fiction future. The Isolator was probably just one of many concepts he explored, and its lack of popular embrace wouldn't have unduly fazed a man whose primary legacy, after all, lies in his foundational role in shaping the genre of science fiction, not in revolutionizing personal headgear for enhanced concentration. And so the Isolator's peculiar story faded. It became one of those historical oddities, a thing that actually existed that seems almost too bizarre to be true. Its tale, however, did not vanish completely. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that decades later, with the rise of the internet and the digital sharing of historical images, photographs of the Isolator began to resurface. They would appear on blogs and online articles and in social media posts, often presented as a meme or a humorous symbol of extreme and delightfully absurd attempts at avoiding distraction, or as a prime example of weird old inventions. In this way, the Isolator has achieved a strange sort of 21st century digital afterlife, its striking, unforgettable visual, igniting a fresh wave of bewildered amusement and historical curiosity in a new generation. An afterlife its inventor likely never envisioned. It's become in a way the most famous, forgotten invention you'd never actually heard of until you suddenly saw that incredible picture, and then you couldn't unsee it. The echoes of isolation, mentioned in our outline title then, are perhaps less about any direct technological descendants, though modern noise-canceling headphones and sophisticated focus-enhancing apps certainly address the same core problem of distraction, with far greater elegance and practicality, and more about its symbolic resonance. Every time you slip on your sleek, modern Bluetooth-enabled noise-canceling headphones to escape the chatter of an open-plan office or the rumble of your daily commute, Perhaps you can spare a fleeting sleepy thought for their gigantic, unwieldy wooden great-great-great-grandpappy, the Isolator. It was bigger. It was undeniably woodier. It required its own private, slightly temperamental oxygen supply, and it made you look like a particularly startled badger, preparing for a minor surgical procedure. But the underlying dream, the fervent human yearning for just a few precious moments of uninterrupted quiet in which to actually think, was exactly the same. The Isolator, in its magnificent failure, remains a testament to that enduring quest. Hugo Gernsback's magnificent, if magnificently flawed Isolator helmet has now faded into the quiet, dusty archives of eccentric invention Egeria. Its brief moment in the sun, or rather in the slightly dim, oxygen-assisted interior of its own making, during that noisy summer of 1925, did not, as we've seen, usher in a new era of helmeted, hyper-focused brain workers. It became a novelty, a curious footnote, a testament perhaps to an inventor's boundless imagination, outstripping the bounds of practical human comfort and societal acceptance. Its tale is one of an idea that, while addressing a genuinely felt problem, offered a solution so extreme, so peculiar, that it was destined for obscurity. But as we gently close the chapter on the Isolator itself, it's worth pondering whether the problem it so audaciously sought to solve, that pervasive, focus-shattering scourge of distraction, truly vanished with the Roaring '20s. Or has it perhaps, like a particularly persistent poltergeist with a penchant for noise, simply returned in a new, even more insidious digital guise to plague our own 21st century quest for a quiet moment to think? You see Egeria, while the specific auditory and visual clamor of the 1920s, the clanging streetcars, the crackling crystal radios, the backfiring Model Ts, may have been replaced by a different set of sensory inputs. The fundamental human struggle for sustained concentration in an increasingly stimulating world feels remarkably and perhaps a little depressingly familiar. A mainstream historical fact is that contemporary society in the early 21st century faces widespread and often quite acute concerns about digital distraction. The pervasive, almost ubiquitous presence of smartphones, the constant allure of social media feeds the endless ocean of information and entertainment available at the click of a button on the internet. All these contribute to a modern environment that many feel is actively fragmenting our attention spans and eroding our capacity for deep, focused work. If Hugo Gernsback were magically transported to our modern world with its relentless barrage of phone notifications, its endless algorithmic social media scrolls, its 24/7 news cycles, and its readily available, infinitely distracting cat videos, his inventive head might literally explode from sheer sensory overload. Or more likely, he'd immediately retreat to his workshop and start designing the Isolator 2. Zart. Now with built-in kitten blocker technology, advanced anti-FOMO, force field, and an optional Faraday cage lining to repel unwanted Wi-Fi signals. The anxieties are strikingly similar. Just as the brain workers of the 1920s lamented the difficulty of concentrating amidst urban noise and the quickening pace of life, many people today report feeling overwhelmed, easily sidetracked, and unable to achieve the kind of deep, uninterrupted thought necessary for complex problem-solving, creative endeavors, or even just quiet reflection. The very concept of deep work, popularized by authors like Cal Newport, has gained traction precisely because so many feel that their ability to engage in it is constantly under siege. We too, it seems, are living through our own concentration crisis, albeit one fueled by silicon chips and fiber optic cables rather than gasoline engines and vacuum tubes. We have in our pockets and on our desks devices far more potent in their ability to distract than anything Gernsback could have imagined. And just as Gernsback sought a technological solution with the Isolator, we too have turned to technology to combat the very problems technology has created. We have focus apps designed to block other, more distracting apps. We have website blockers, notification silencers, and digital wellness tools that solemnly inform us we've spent slightly too much time today looking at pictures of artistically arranged artisanal toast. We have noise-canceling headphones, the sleek, comfortable, and vastly more practical descendants of the Isolator's core soundproofing idea, that allow us to create our own little bubbles of auditory peace amidst the din of open-plan offices or noisy commutes. It's like we're constantly trying to build a digital Isolator helmet for our digital lives, a software-based sanctuary to shield our fragile attention spans from the relentless pinging and buzzing of the modern world. Gernsback was in his own wonderfully weird and ahead of his time way, grappling with a problem that has only intensified in the intervening century. He just, approached it with significantly more wood. A greater reliance on felt and a slightly less nuanced understanding of basic human respiratory needs. Cognitive psychologists and sociologists today continue to vigorously debate the precise, long-term effects of our pervasive digital media consumption on fundamental human attention spans, our deeper cognitive abilities, and even the very nature of our social interactions. With some researchers arguing for significant negative impacts, sometimes referred to with alarming terms like digital dementia or the shallowing of thought, while others emphasize human adaptability. The development of new forms of digital literacy, and the potential for new types of multitasking or information processing skills to emerge in response to these new technological environments. The underlying desire that fueled the Isolator, however, remains profoundly human and instantly recognizable: the yearning for a space free from interruption, a quiet harbor where thoughts can unfold, ideas can gestate, and creative work can be done without the constant fragmenting pressure of external stimuli. The Isolator failed not because the problem it addressed was trivial, but because its proposed solution was too extreme, too cumbersome, and ultimately too uncomfortable for the average human being. It ignored the fact that we are not just brains in jars or helmets. We are embodied creatures who need a degree of comfort, freedom of movement, and yes, a reliable supply of untethered oxygen to function optimally. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights this enduring quest for distraction-free environments is the emergence in recent years of dedicated, distraction-free writing devices. Gadgets like the FreeWrite or the Pomera deliberately limit their functionality to just typing, offering a very basic screen, a good keyboard, and absolutely no internet browser, no email, no games, no social media notifications. They are in essence a kind of minimalist digital version of the Isolator's core principle of visual and functional restriction, but without the need for a cumbersome helmet or an external oxygen supply. It seems Hugo Gernsback's fundamental idea of creating a specialized tool to aid focus wasn't entirely off the mark. It was just his particular 1920s execution that was, shall we say, a trifle over-engineered, and perhaps just a little too enthusiastic in its embrace of total sensory deprivation. The 1920s brain worker just wanted to escape the incessant distracting sound of their neighbor's enthusiastic but rhythmically challenged Charleston practice. The 21st century brain worker just wants to escape the equally incessant, equally distracting sound of their own smartphone, compulsively dinging, buzzing, and vibrating with notifications about things they don't really truly care about from people they barely know about events that have already happened. The more things change, Ageria, the more we all just really seem to want a reasonably quiet room. A comfortable chair and a decent cup of coffee, or perhaps a soothing herbal tea in which to simply get some uninterrupted thinking done. The Isolator may be a forgotten novelty, but the problem it tried to solve is alas more relevant than ever. The clatter and jazz of the roaring 20s. Ageria, with its anxieties about noise and its yearning for focus, now begin to soften and recede into the gentle quiet of our sleepy narrative's close. Hugo Gernsback's peculiar Isolator helmet, that magnificent if misguided wooden fortress of solitude, with its tiny eye slits and its essential, if somewhat alarming oxygen tank, has played its curious part in our story and now fades back into the mists of inventive history. We've seen how this strange contraption, born of a genuine desire to shield the brain worker from the distractions of a rapidly modernizing world, ultimately succumbed to its own inherent impracticalities, becoming more a symbol of eccentric ingenuity than a widely adopted tool. Yet as the image of that solemn helmeted figure hunched over a desk dissolves the underlying human quest it represented, the deep enduring need for quiet contemplation, for uninterrupted thought, for sanctuary from the relentless clamor of the outside world, remains as potent and as relevant today as it was in the bustling, distraction-filled days of 1925. The technologies may change the sources of our distractions, may evolve from sputtering Model Ts and crackling crystal radios to the incessant pinging of smartphones and the endless scroll of the internet. But that fundamental human desire to find a still, quiet space within which to connect with our own thoughts, to create, to learn, to simply be endures. So as the story of the Isolator gently lulls you towards your own peaceful quiet, may you find a measure of that sought-after serenity, a brief respite from the noises of your own world. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll dream of a world where focus comes easily and where the most peculiar inventions are simply charmingly sleepy tales from a very distant, very inventive past. The Isolator helmet, Egeria, that peculiar wooden head fortress born of Hugo Gernsback's inventive mind, and the noisy anxieties of the Roaring Twenties has now largely faded into the mists of historical curiosity. We've seen how its grand promise of soundproofed serenity and unparalleled focus was ultimately undone by a host of rather significant practical flaws. Its cumbersome nature, its reliance on a hissy oxygen tank, its claustrophobic embrace, and its comically restrictive field of vision. It didn't revolutionize the working habits of brain workers. It wasn't eagerly adopted by students or writers, and it certainly didn't become a must-have accessory for anyone seeking a quiet moment in a bustling world. Instead, it became a footnote, a charmingly eccentric example of an invention that, for all its bold ingenuity, simply failed to take off. And this Egeria leads us to a broader, sleepier contemplation. Why do some inventions, even those addressing a genuine need, ultimately find their place in what we might call the invention's graveyard, while others go on to change the world? The Isolator now rests peacefully, one imagines, in that vast, dusty, and often rather amusing graveyard of good ideas that sounded considerably better on paper, or in this case, in a very enthusiastically written article in Science and Invention magazine. It's probably sharing a quiet, forgotten plot with other marvels like self-stirring teacups that had an unfortunate tendency to vigorously fling hot tea at the ceiling, solar-powered underpants that only worked effectively during Saharan heat waves, and perhaps that talking dog collar that only ever managed to say sausages in a slightly menacing baritone. The history of invention. Egeria is littered with countless examples of devices that, despite addressing real or perceived needs or showcasing undeniable flashes of innovative thinking, ultimately failed to achieve widespread adoption or commercial success. One of the most crucial factors, as the Isolator so perfectly illustrates, is the delicate and often elusive balance between innovation and practicality. Hugo Gernsback certainly identified a real problem: the increasing difficulty of finding quiet and focus in a modern distraction-filled world. That was an innovative insight, and his desire to create a technological solution was characteristic of his forward-thinking problem-solving mindset. However, the execution, the actual physical manifestation of that solution, was where things went a bit wobbly. The Isolator, in its attempt to be an absolute solution, blocking out all sound, all peripheral vision, became so extreme in its design that it sacrificed almost all semblance of user comfort, convenience, and frankly basic human dignity. A good idea, when poorly or impractically executed, often remains just that, an idea that didn't quite make the leap to successful reality. The user experienced a concept perhaps less formally articulated in 1925, but intuitively understood, was clearly not a primary design consideration for the Isolator, beyond its core function of well isolating. You get the distinct feeling that Gernsback's primary user testing for the Isolator probably consisted of him personally wearing a prototype for approximately 5 minutes, triumphantly declaring it a groundbreaking triumph of modern science and human ingenuity, and then immediately taking it off to enthusiastically write an article about its amazing potential before he actually passed out from CO2 buildup or developed a permanent helmet-shaped indentation in his shoulders. Thoroughness perhaps was not its strongest suit in the R&D department. Then there's the crucial factor of societal acceptance and timing. Was the world, even the noise-weary world of the 1920s, truly ready for a device as visually startling and socially isolating as the Isolator, even if it had been more comfortable and practical? The sheer bizarreness of its appearance? The image of individuals voluntarily encasing their heads in large wooden boxes would have been a significant social hurdle. Cultural norms, aesthetics, and the perceived strangeness of a new technology play a huge role in its adoption. The Isolator, alas, probably scored rather highly on the deeply strange and slightly terrifying end of that particular spectrum. It also raises the question of market demand. While many people undoubtedly craved more focus, did enough of them crave it so desperately that they were willing to embrace such an extreme, cumbersome, and frankly rather isolating solution Perhaps the problem for most wasn't yet perceived as being dire enough to warrant such a drastic personal intervention. Historians of technology often debate the relative importance of technological determinism. The idea that technology itself is the primary driver of social change, and that a truly superior technology will inevitably succeed versus the theory of social construction of technology, Scott, which argues that societal needs, cultural values, political interests, and consumer choices play a far more significant role in shaping which technologies are developed, adopted, and ultimately succeed or fail. Inventions like the isolator provide fascinating, if somewhat comical, case studies for this ongoing discussion, strongly suggesting that no matter how scientifically an inventor believes their solution addresses a problem, if society isn't ready for it, doesn't like the look of it, or finds it too impractical to integrate into daily life, it's likely destined for that aforementioned invention graveyard. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you, Ageria, is the existence in our modern times of dedicated spaces like the Museum of Failure, which has had physical exhibitions and a strong online presence. This museum and similar collections lovingly showcases products and inventions that flopped spectacularly often for reasons very similar to those that doomed the isolator. A disconnect between the inventor's vision and actual user needs, poor design, bad timing, or sometimes just being a solution to a problem nobody actually had. The isolator, with its striking visuals and its grand unfulfilled promise, would be a prime A-list exhibit in such an institution, probably displayed right next to a Betamax video recorder and a bottle of new Coke. The economic viability of an invention is, of course, another critical factor. Would the isolator have been affordable for its target audience of students, writers, and inventors, many of whom were not known for their vast disposable incomes? The cost of materials, solid wood, felt glass. The oxygen tank and its refills and construction would likely have made it a relatively expensive piece of personal equipment. And would the perceived benefits have justified that cost for anyone other than the most desperately distraction-prone individuals Gernsback? While a successful publisher may not have had the resources or the inclination to mass-produce and market such a niche, and frankly rather difficult to sell item, sometimes even truly brilliant ideas fail due to bad luck, insufficient funding, or simply being ahead of their time before the necessary supporting technologies or societal readiness are in place. Other times, as with the isolator, the failure seems more inherent in the design itself, a fundamental misjudgment of human factors and the practical usability. Yet even in its failure, the isolator serves a purpose. It highlights with almost painful clarity the very real problem of distraction that Gernsback was trying to address. And it reminds us that the path of invention is rarely a straight line from brilliant idea to world-changing success. It's often a messy, iterative process filled with missteps, quirky detours, and a great many fascinating, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempts to solve the perennial problems of human existence. The isolator's main legacy, then, isn't a world filled with peacefully helmeted, hyper-focused thinkers, but rather a wonderfully illustrative, cautionary tale for inventors everywhere, and perhaps a gentle, sleepy lesson for us all. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best, and a very large wooden hat, however well-intentioned, is not always the answer. And so, Ageria, the isolator helmet. Hugo Gernsback's audacious, if ultimately ill-fated, attempt to conquer the distractions of the Roaring Twenties now takes its quiet place in the grand, dusty, and often rather amusing museum of inventions that seemed like a really good idea at the time, mostly to the inventor. We've seen how its journey from a bold concept to a peculiar physical reality was fraught with practical challenges. The claustrophobia, the cumbersome oxygen tank, the comically tiny eye slits the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of it all, leading it not to market triumph but to a gentle, almost immediate slide into historical obscurity, destined to be remembered more as a bizarre novelty than a revolutionary tool for brain workers. Yet as we prepare to leave this tale of soundproofed serenity and pinhole perspectives, it's worth reflecting on the deeper, more enduring human desire that sparked its creation, the timeless, relentless quest for pure, unadulterated focus. Hugo Gernsback's dream for the isolator. When you strip away the layers of wood, felt, and slightly alarming rubber tubing, was, at its core, a rather noble one. He envisioned a sanctuary for the mind, a personal haven, where the dedicated thinker could retreat from the incessant bombardment of external stimuli and commune directly with their own thoughts, their ideas, their creative wellspring. His intention was genuinely to help people concentrate, to unlock their intellectual potential, to allow for those moments of deep, uninterrupted contemplation that can lead to breakthroughs in science, art, or philosophy. No more distracting bird song, interrupting your profound musings on the nature of the cosmos. No more noisy neighbors practicing their Charleston routines while you're on the verge of inventing cold fusion. No more sudden, unwelcome existential crises about whether you remembered to pay the milkman, because your mind is entirely blissfully and perhaps even a little sweatily immersed in pure, unadulterated, oxygen-assisted brain time. That was the dream. And this dream, this yearning for focus, is far from unique to the 1920s or to the delightfully eccentric mind of Hugo Gernsback. A mainstream historical fact is that the pursuit of tools, environments, or behavioral practices designed to enhance human concentration and reduce distraction has been a recurring theme throughout human history. Monks in medieval monasteries sought silence and solitude in their scriptoria and individual carrel small partitioned study spaces to meticulously copy manuscripts or engage in deep theological contemplation. Scholars in the Renaissance retreated to their private studio lives surrounded by books and objects intended to inspire thought. Writers and artists through the ages have famously sought out quiet attics, remote cottages, or simply locked their doors, all in an effort to create a space conducive to uninterrupted creative flow. The human desire to optimize mental performance to shield the mind from the slings and arrows of outrageous distraction is an ancient and persistent one. The isolator then can be seen as a particularly extreme, almost comically literal early 20th century technological manifestation of this enduring human desire. Its fatal flaw, as we've discussed, was not necessarily in its core objective, but in its profoundly impractical and user-unfriendly execution. It attempted to achieve an absolute, almost aggressive form of isolation that ultimately created more problems than it solved. The irony, of course, is that a device designed to promote peace of mind and serene focus likely induced a fair amount of anxiety, discomfort, and possibly even mild panic in anyone unfortunate enough to be encased within it for more than a few minutes. Whether the fundamental human capacity for deep sustained concentration is a relatively fixed cognitive trait, or if it is significantly malleable and profoundly shaped by prevailing cultural environments, educational practices, and dominant technological habits, is a complex question that continues to engage and often divide psychologists, educators, neuroscientists, and social critics, particularly in our current age of pervasive, algorithmically driven digital stimuli and concerns about shortened attention spans. The isolator, in its own quaint way, was Gernsback's attempt to wrestle with this very question, albeit with tools of wood and felt, rather than cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness apps. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that, despite its spectacular lack of success as a practical device, the isolator has achieved a curious sort of posthumous cult appeal in the 21st century. Images of it frequently resurface online, often shared with a mixture of disbelief and affection among enthusiasts of retro-futurism, steampunk aesthetics, or simply delightfully bizarre and failed inventions. Its very strangeness, its uncompromising commitment to its flawed premise gives it a peculiar, undeniable charm. It has become a memorable, if not particularly marketable piece of design, a visual shorthand for extreme, almost comically dedicated attempts at avoiding distraction. What then is the ultimate silence of the isolator? As hinted at in our outline, it is perhaps threefold. Firstly, there's the literal, physical silence it so ambitiously, if imperfectly, sought to impose upon its wearer, that dream of a world devoid of distracting sound. Secondly, there's the silence of its market reception. Its failure to speak to a wider audience, its inability to convince people that encasing their heads in a wooden box was a viable path to enhanced productivity, leading to its swift commercial demise. And thirdly, there is its subsequent historical silence for many decades, a mostly forgotten object, a whisper from a past filled with inventive fervor only to be rediscovered and reshared in our own new age of distraction. Hugo Gernsback's peculiar helmet may now reside firmly in that metaphorical invention's graveyard, a testament to a vision that, while addressing a real human need, offered a solution far too extreme for practical adoption. But the dream that fueled it, that deep human yearning for a quiet space in which to think, to create, to simply be without interruption, that dream remains as potent and as relevant today as it was in the Roaring '20s. The isolator now sits silently in the museum of, well, it certainly seemed like a good idea, at the time at least to me, the inventor. It serves as a charming, if slightly cautionary reminder that sometimes the most direct path to serene focus isn't necessarily paved with solid wood, soundproof felt, and an external oxygen tank, but perhaps just with a good pair of modern noise-canceling earplugs, a polite "do not disturb" sign that people actually pay attention to, and the timeless human ability to occasionally just close the door. Even though it was by most objective measures a spectacular flop, there's something almost endearingly heroic about the isolator's sheer uncompromising and gloriously unapologetic weirdness. It was the ultimate go big or go home and invent something slightly less terrifying approach to personal productivity. Mostly, as we know, it went home. Word count 1396. The flickering gas lamps of the 1920s Ageria and the ghostly image of Hugo Gernsback's isolator helmet begin to recede, now dimming into the soft quiet of our sleepy history's end. We have peered into an era of unprecedented noise and exhilarating distraction, and witnessed one man's uniquely peculiar and ultimately rather impractical attempt to carve out a sanctuary of silence for the beleaguered human mind, the isolator. With its solid wooden shell, its tiny eye slits, and its essential, if somewhat alarming oxygen tank, may not have revolutionized the working habits of a generation, nor found its way into the hallowed halls of every library and study. It remains instead a charmingly eccentric testament to the inventive spirit, a curious footnote in the long, ongoing human quest for focus. Yet, as the clatter of Model Ts and the strains of jazz fade away, the underlying yearning that inspired the isolator lingers with us. That deep desire for a quiet space, for a moment of uninterrupted thought, for a shield against the endless barrage of stimuli. It is a profoundly human and remarkably timeless aspiration. In our own hyper-connected, digitally saturated world, we seek our own modern-day isolators, perhaps in noise-canceling headphones, mindfulness apps, or simply in the precious fleeting moments of unplugged solitude we can find. So as the story of this wonderfully strange helmet gently lulls you towards your own peaceful rest, may you find a quiet corner in your mind, a serene space free from the day's distractions. And may your dreams be filled with the gentle hum of pure, uninterrupted, and blissfully unhelmeted thought.